Learn modern web development with Python and FastAPI by building 5 projects. Zach is an experienced software engineer, and in this course, he'll teach you how to build apps using an event-driven architecture that manages different tasks, all implemented using FastAPI.
Welcome to this modern Python course. We will be building web applications that utilize FastAPI and some other modern libraries that will help you build full-stack development projects. My name is Zach and I am a software engineer based in London. I wanted to design a course that will demonstrate some of the modern usage of Python's web development frameworks, and I believe that with this type of project building, you can really practice relevant portfolio skills that can help you progress your career in this particular industry. Before we dive in, let's talk about what you need to know to get the most out of this course. You should have a basic understanding of Python programming, as well as some familiarity with some front-end technologies like HTML, CSS, and basic JavaScript. Additionally, a fundamental knowledge of HTTP networking is a requirement here, as we don't really go into the details of how these certain protocols work. We will review some of the key concepts as they're needed throughout the course. Since I wanted for this project to be useful for developers trying to land their first job as a Python backend engineer, I implemented some of the more advanced topics, like example of using multi-threading for dealing with asynchronous tasks when doing API integrations. If I could summarize the importance of this entire course in one sentence, I would say that in a way you are building some kind of an event-driven architecture and managing different tasks in the implementation of FastAPI's framework. I did my best to implement without too much redundancy things like database integrations so that the coders here can get some hands-on experience with various APIs and databases. First, we'll build a real-time translation service using FastAPI and GPT-4. This project will show you how to harness the power of language models to create an application that can translate text in real time. For our second project, you will learn how to create a tool that not only generates content, but it also analyzes the sentiment. The third project, we use FastAPI and OpenAI, where you will learn how to interact with external APIs and process data to create a functional and useful web application. In the fourth project, we'll switch gears a bit and create an image-to-text web app with PyTesseract and Flask. You'll see how to integrate OCR technology into a web app to extract text from images. And finally, we'll wrap up with a Kivy app for downloading videos. This project will introduce you to Kivy for building multi-touch applications, and you'll learn how to integrate it with various APIs to download video content. I feel like these 5 projects will definitely help you use Python for some modern application. So let's get started and bring these projects to life. We will build a translation service application. It will be a web-based tool designed to translate text into multiple languages. For our backend, we'll use FastAPI. We'll have a database with Postgres, and for the translation, we'll communicate with OpenAI's ChatGPT-4 model. This is what the end result will be. The user can input the desired text for the translation here, and also insert any number of languages that they want their text translated to. They can hit translate, and this will execute a post request to our API service, and FastAPI will then try to communicate with ChatGPT to provide the translation. Whilst this is happening, we want to inform the user that we have received their request, so it will return a 200 whilst it's asynchronously processing the translation and waiting for that to come back. So once the results have landed back onto our FastAPI app, we want to display them dynamically without the user having to click anything. So we'll be building this event-driven architecture, and this is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of the video. We also added a search functionality here, which will allow the user to query the database and check the status of any particular translation order. Also, by querying the ID, they'll be able to check the content, so they can historically browse through any of the previous translations. So this is what the project structure will look like, and it's pretty straightforward. So this is our web app. So it's our FastAPI. FastAPI utilizing conventional file structure. This will be our front end, and Alembic will handle all the database migrations. This will be our configuration files, and because in the end, we'll also create a Docker image for easy deployment. So we are moving to our VS Code now, and we will start coding the project. So you want to create your main folder. And inside, you want to create another subfolder. We'll call it app. Inside of that folder, you want to create your main py, and this will be our FastAPI client. Now we will make sure that we have our virtual environment running. Let me zoom in a bit here. You want to make sure that you're in your main folder, and we will create a new environment. Once this is completed, you want to activate this environment so we can install our dependencies. So I'm going to use PowerShell for that. So you want to navigate into your environment, scripts, and I believe here should be your activate.ps1. And once you see this prefix, it means you have activated your virtual environment. So now we can install our dependencies that we'll be using for this project. So for that, we'll create a requirements text file. And I'm just going to copy everything that I know we need here. Keep in mind, very important, we have to use a specific version of OpenAI for this to work. So it has to be OpenAI 0.28.0. We also need Alembic, and now we can install all of the dependencies. So you want to navigate back to your main working directory, and you can type in pip install r requirements.txt. Once this is completed, I came back too quick. Oh, it wasn't saved. So you want to type in pip install all requirements, and once this is completed, we can start writing the code. So it might take a minute. We can start writing something in our main.py file. From FastAPI, import FastAPI. This is something we'll use later on, but you might as well do it now. Background tasks, HTTP exception, request, and depends. We'll also import HTML responses. We will import course middleware. And to be able to render an HTML page, we will import Ginger 2 templates. With that being said, we'll say that FastAPI is in our app variable, and we can create a templates folder inside of this app folder. So you want to make sure that you're in the right place. Go cd app, make sure that you're there. Type in pwd, which stands for print working directory. You want to see that you are in app, and then type in make directory templates. Inside of the templates, we'll create our index.html file. And for now, we can just put in an exclamation mark to generate an automatic HTML file, and we'll just say hello. So we can test that our app is running and rendering a page. So we want to define our first endpoint. To do that, we'll start with the get decorator, and we'll call our first path index, and the response class will be HTML response. Call the function index, and you can take in a request, which is going for the request FastAPI library, and it will return the rendered version of the index.html file. So we'll say return templates, template response. So template response, and we want to name our file that we want rendered, and we'll give it the request to be the request that was passed on to our main function here. So you can see that it's showing me this error, templates is not defined. So we need to make sure our FastAPI app knows where to find this file. So we will have to set this up, set up for two templates. So we will say that our templates is, and then we will give it the directory file path, and there will be templates. So this now is looking for the templates folder which we have just created. So typo there, we need a colon. So if we run this now, we should be able to see our index.html file on a local host. So if you go to your terminal and you make sure that you're in your app folder, and you type in uvicorn main:app reload. We didn't save. Restarting, and we can see that it's running. If we go to the browser and we type in localhost, give it port 8000 and index, we can see this is what our index.html file has. So if I was to save this, put all these exclamation marks, refresh this, you can see that it gets updated. So this means our FastAPI web server is running. So we will go back to our index.html file and start writing some front-end code to create the basic structure of this web app. So this is our translation service. That'll be the title. We can delete this. And I'm going to add a bootstrap link in the head segment. So you want to do the same. Just have this copy pasted. Other than looking at the video and having to type all of this in the link, just go to my GitHub. The link will be in the description, and on index.html file, you can just find this particular link and copy paste it. And you should do the same for the style as well. So we're not going to explain the basics of CSS in this video. This video is more about API integration, especially with the new services like the ChatGPT's API. And it's pretty self-explanatory. If you just read through it, you will immediately know what everything does here. So we're just defining some of these aesthetic properties for our HTML elements that we will build right now. So we will create some kind of a navbar at the top. These will be the properties. And we can add some kind of a text where we say that with the class navbar, and the top of it will be translation service. This can be anything you want, really. So next, we'll open a new container, and inside of this div, we'll open a form. So this is where the important part in regards to the front end comes. Starting our form that we'll submit to our FastAPI for translation. So we'll give label here to be for text to translate. So this later on, we'll write our JavaScript functions within this one index.html file that will do all the front-end processing towards the backend, the FastAPI. So that's, in my opinion, another positive aspect of this project, that you will actually write some backend with Python and still touch upon the front-end aspects written in JavaScript as well. There's no need for that there. And we'll type in that this is the text to translate. In this, and we'll close the label. And this will be the text area. And we'll give it a class form control. And we'll give it the ID text to translate. So they can have 4 rows, and we'll give it this placeholder and close the tag. So just make sure you close this text area tag after giving it the placeholder to be end the text here. Close the tag. We move on. We want to close this div. No, not the form yet, just the div. We can copy paste this and just slightly modify it to now include the input for the languages that the user wants the translation for. So it's again form group. Oh, I forgot to put that on the top as well. Just a second. We don't want to move on without including that. So you want to go back above this translation form, and in here we will give the form ID. That's a double one. So just this line was missing. We are opening a form group here. So we're doing that again now to include the languages input. And after you finish with the placeholder, you can close the tag and close the div. And underneath of this, there'll be a submit button. So it's just a button type button, but the important aspect now is to just identify at this point that the on click for this button will be a JavaScript function that we will write pretty soon. So that'll be at the bottom of our file here. And this is our form. So we can close the form here. Just make that consistent there. So now we want to write the HTML element for displaying the translation results. So we'll create some space here for readability. So this particular div will be the HTML element that displays the results. Make sure that you have the ID in this particular syntax here. So pre-ID translation results. This will be important for the event architecture. Make sure that div is closed, and we're starting a new div. So this will be the progress container. So as we said earlier, we want to make sure that the process of translation and display for the user is being transparent towards the user. So in case they have a very long file that they want to translate, they'll have to wait for it. We want to make sure that the user is aware that that request has been accepted. It's in progress. So this particular div will be a display function for that, and it will include some kind of a visual representation of the progress bar. And now we want to include our search functionality, but before that, let's see how this HTML file looks. So if we go back to our browser and refresh this, it looks a bit messy at the moment. This will all fall into place as we build the rest of the HTML elements, but we can see that this is a part of the nav bar at the moment. We didn't close the main div that we opened, so everything is being chucked into a single div at the moment. That'll be sorted in a minute, but we can see that everything else is in place. So we'll just continue with our work. So now we want the search functionality. So we will open a new div here and add the text of check translation by ID. So we want to be able to query the database and then return the status. So keep in mind, in my opinion, the only important thing to really take away from this is that inside of this particular input for the form, it will be interacting with our JavaScript. So the on-click functions for our buttons are very important. And this is why we write here on-click equals, and then these two particular functions that we'll write at the bottom of the page right now. So make sure that div is closed, and we'll open a new div, and this will be the translation status. So we want to display the actual text from the database that the translation is still in progress or if it's completed. And then finally, we want to display if user clicks this button, so the second button, which will call the function that queries the database for the content of the translation. This will be the div that will display it. So when it comes to our HTML elements, that's it. We just now need to write the functions, the JavaScript functions, and we have pretty much completed our front end. So we will open a script tag here. This is where our JavaScript will go. Before that, make sure you get the links for the bootstrap that we're using for this front end. So once again, it's important that you don't just try to type what you're about to see by looking this video. Rather, go to my GitHub, the first link you'll see in the description, and locate this file. You will see then at this particular line, there will be this. We can align that back. So make sure that you copy paste this from the actual file, rather than trying to write it. But by all means, if you feel like it, you can just retype it from the video. So now we want to start writing our JavaScript. Before we type some JavaScript, let's see how does the updated front end look now. So if we go back to our browser and we refresh, this still looks like a mess. So we want to go back and make sure we find where I made a mistake and fix it. So going back to our code, this was our CSS, move on. So as I said, we haven't closed one of the elements. So everything got bundled. I briefly talked about it, but forgot to type the text. So we'll close the navbar here and go back to our browser and see. Yep, there we go. So this is our front end finished now. And as you can see, the inputs for the users are here. The translate button is here, and everything then will be displayed underneath the translate button. So now we can write the logic in JavaScript that will take this data. So if I want to translate, this is what I want to translate. And in here, I type in English. So it's already in English, German, and French. If I click the button, I want the translation to appear here once it's done. But keep in mind, in case the text is long, and we will test that version as well, where we are trying to translate a huge amount of text and it will take time. I don't want to just have nothing happening whilst I'm waiting. We don't want the user having to click anything or refresh the page manually themselves. So just to make sure, if you do search for Axios JavaScript, you'll be able to get more information about this and what it does. But as you can see, it's a promise-based HTTP client. So by using it, we'll be able to do requests. So we didn't have to install it in npm because we put this link in our script, so we are able to use it through the link of the script. So we'll go back to our code and we'll finish off the front end officially with the JavaScript functions that we need. So we will do a async function. We'll call it submit translation, and we'll give it a text variable that will extract the user's text by using getElementById, and we will give it the ID text to translate .value. So this will grab this text, so from this HTML element, and it will store it in our text variable. So we can copy paste this, and we'll do the same to have our languages stored as an array in this variable called languages. So the different ID will be languages, like so. And we want to format this to be an array of strings. So in here, you want to do .split and a map that will trim it. So just have a look at this text and rewrite it yourself, because this is just a simple logic to do some formatting to have a comma separated array of strings for our languages choice of the user. Now I want to write some logic that will prevent the user from submitting an empty input. We don't want to query the database or just to create this unnecessary network traffic to ChatGPT if the user is submitting an empty text, empty arrays basically. So we'll say if not text, languages length be 0 and languages to have to be empty. And then we'll write just to return an alert in the browser that will say please provide both text and target language, and we can just return. So I want to implement a progress bar. If the user has to wait for a significant amount of time, it's just nice to have this more interactive experience in terms of the interface the user is working with. So we'll create this progress bar. And keep in mind, this is not just about the visual, about implementing something new and nice to see visually. We also need to write our own logic that will synchronize the progress bar with the actual backend process. So this is where Axios comes in so handy, and we'll make sure that these events happen in the same time, in real time for the user. We'll create some space here, and we'll define our progress bar, and we'll say that this is a document. You can get it by ID. The ID will be progress bar, and we'll do the text on the progress bar be the same, but here with the ID change it to progress text. And we want to make sure that the progress bar can get restarted if the user gives a new request. So we'll say progress bar last list and remove if it was successful, like so. And we want to add, I'll call this primary, and this will be style. We'll give it the style width, style.width to be for the style of 0%. And then we'll also have progress.text that we want displayed, and it will be text content. So this doesn't have a dot, so delete that. So progress text content, and this will say that the translation is in progress. So now we'll write the Axios function that will execute the post request with the payload. So we will say try, this will be the const response, and it will await post, and here will be the link of our endpoint, which we still haven't built that. So this will be what we'll do on our FastAPI file. So we will call this endpoint translate. So after giving the endpoint, open the curly braces so we can give it the payload, and we'll say that the text is the variable text and the languages are the variable languages. So this is not capital. I don't know why I did that. And we want to close this. So I made a typo here. You need to go back to where I provided the endpoint link and delete these parentheses here so that we can close them here. Hope you can see my cursor. Make sure you close them here. All right, moving on. Now we'll define the task ID to go into the response object and get the parameter of task ID. And we'll give it the alert that will say that the task ID is, and give it $sizing. It's the task ID. So the reason why we have this here, keep in mind, we said it'll be important for the user to receive a confirmation that the request that they've sent, we have received it and we are processing it. This is to cover the case where the input is large and it will take time to translate all of this and return it back to the user. So we want to instantiate some objects here. So we'll change the display. So this will be the part that dynamically changes the display. So initially in this process, at this stage, we want to set all of this to none. So feel free to either pause and rewrite this from the video or go to my GitHub and copy paste this particular bit. And then from here, we'll say that translation result is null and the progress is 0. And we will say whilst progress is 0, is less than 100, sorry. And we'll write some logic saying await a new promise, which will resolve through the timeout. And we'll set timeout at 1,000. So by the way, these are milliseconds. So this is 1 second. So 1,000 milliseconds. So with this polling technology, we want to make sure that this is constantly awaiting the response from the backend. And it will check for that every second. And then we'll say that constant result response will be the GET request. And again, we'll give it the local host, the endpoint of translate, and use this syntax to make sure that it gets the exact ID of the entry. Oh, I made a typo here, so this needs Axios. So we want to declare that our translation result then is the result response of data, and writing translation result status then being changed to completed. This will also mean that our progress has reached 100, aka 100%, or else we'll give this in the interval of 50%. So our progress bar will do increments or either 0, meaning nothing has started yet. If something is in progress, it'll be at 50%. And then the third state will be a completed state, which is 100%. So we'll say that the width of the progress bar in this case would be 50%. So now I just wanted to add some extra visual components to it. So we want to change the color to green and text according to the events that happen. So we'll target progress bar, and once it's successful, we can dynamically update the text by saying translation complete. So you want to write another document, get element by ID. This one will target translation results, and we want to stringify the data there. And we will do another document, get element by ID. This one will target the results, and we want to make sure that this display now is set at block. And we can close the curly braces. and write catch error statement, and we can display this in our console. So this is just for debugging in case something goes wrong, error submitting translation, and we want to see that error so we can display it there. And we'll also give an alert in the actual browser, and we'll say an error occurred while translating. Please try again. So curly braces are closed. And now we'll use another two functions. So we want to add search functionality component. And with this, we can do this later. So we don't want to forget that. But we will have two functions. So I'm just going to open the structure for it, and we'll return to this. So this will be our check translation status. And for now, we'll give it, is there a pass? Just something that won't cause an error. And there will be another one that checks for content. So it'll be check translation content. So we will return to this later. So I believe that should be it. So all of our front end is completed other than the last two functions where we want to add the search functionality, and we can deal with that practically at the end. So once we actually have everything up and running, we will add this ability to go through our database and historically retrieve any of the completed or not completed translations. So with that being said, we'll move on to our backend. So this is where we left off. We defined the endpoint that through a GET request renders an index.html page. So the first thing that we will do is set up our database. So you want to create these files now. You want to do database.py. You want to do models.py, create crud.py, and create schemas.py. Now a good point to discuss how does this process actually work with the front end communicating with backend, and what are the roles of these individual files here. So if we go back to do some drawing, we'll go down here. So I'm going to create some boxes here, and we're going to say this is our front end, this will be our database, and this will be our FastAPI service. So this is our backend. So as you saw, there is a particular input that the user will give us in the front end. So this is the input. Just for the sake of this wonderful diagram, I'm going to refer to this as a payload. So instead of I, it's going to be P, which stands for payload. We already know that this payload will be text and languages. So text that they wish to be translated into these languages. So this will be our payload. We'll send this as a JSON. We have this HTML that allows the user to input this text to create this payload. And then with the Axios code that we've written to execute a post request, this post request will go to our FastAPI endpoint. So more specifically, that's the translate endpoint. Then we want our FastAPI service to first make sure that it knows what to do with this data and that it also can receive this data. So this is why we created this schemas.py. So what we're going to do in the schemas.py is to make sure that the data is validated so that it lands on our FastAPI service in a format that we can work with it. As you saw, we want to implement this search functionality by using ID. So we will then write some logic that will take the payload from this point and store it into our database. So I'm just going to mark that this payload has initially been given to the front end with a post request. This payload now has reached the backend, and then the backend gives it to a database so it can receive a unique ID. So now this payload here will have some kind of an ID. So let's just give it a random numeric value. Let's say this is now number 4, P4. So payload with an ID 4. We will have some further logic that will send the payload to ChatGPT. So this will be our external API here. So we will say open API for translation. So our FastAPI service will need some logic that does that. Once that is returned, we will have our FastAPI store it in a database. So this flow now has another line. We can say that once it reaches that place, it needs to go into the database. So initially, this part was just storing the payload and giving it. So it was ID and payload, which was text and languages. But on the second entry, as you can see, this blue line, this becomes the translated payload, and it will just be the text. And then once this event has been confirmed, there has to be some logic that will inform the front end of that data that you originally sent to me as a payload. Well, I've done what you asked of me, and it's ready for you to use. And then in that case, the backend will deliver the payload with the ID and with the translation of the text. So I'm just going to put TT, translated text. So then all of this can be displayed on our front end. So this ugly looking diagram is an explanation of this event architecture. So first things first, something that I like to get out of the way, and it's pretty much the standard for me in the development process. Keep in mind, for deployment, this requires a little bit more talk based on specific circumstances of how you want to deploy your project. But for now, for this project, we want to make sure that once we do run it locally, if we want to tinker around with certain things, I don't want errors to come up. So I'm going to make course not a problem immediately by adding this middleware. So we imported that in the beginning of the tutorial, and we're going to use it like this. Not the most important aspect of this video. So we will move on. So remember, I want to have my endpoints for handling data. So we'll say app.post, and this is our main translate endpoint, and we'll give it a response class, response model, and we'll have a schema for this. So this will be the moment where we write our validations with Pydantic. So stop this for a second and open your schemas.py file. And in here you want to import Pydantic base model, and you want to get from typing list and dictionary. And we will have three classes. One will be translation request, and it will inherit from base model, and this will be the string of the text that the user has given us for translation, and then the list of languages. This will be a list of strings. Next is the task response. This will also inherit from base model, not base exception, and this will be the ID that we are returning to the front end as soon as the request has been made. Lastly, we have translation style, and this will also get base model and have task ID, integer, status string, and translations should be dictionary of strings. So these are our schemas, and the purpose of them will be to validate the data, to make sure that the data, before getting processed, before we assign it all sorts of work to do, is in the format of how we want it to be. So you can close your schemas.py. That's all we're going to do with that. One more thing before we deal with the rest of the schema implementation. You also want to create a file here called init. So in case then you want to have a different way of importing, for example, instead of saying here import schemas, we'll be able to import from schemas and then give it the exact names of the requests. So in order for that to work, you will need this init file. But even if you leave it just with import schemas, all of the schemas would work. That's up to you now for your preference. So we want to make sure that the incoming data, which is a part of our request variable here, so that's our payload, is validated by our translation request schema. And then what we are returning is task response schemas. So if I open a second tab here just for you to have a quick look, the incoming payload is going according to the request. So the input from the user, which is text in the language that they want translation in, and the task response will just be the ID. So all that will send back to the user is the ID. Keep in mind, this goes along with what we decided to do, that once the user has clicked translate this for me, what they will receive immediately is a 200, or this is your process. It has an ID, and since it's actually processed and the bar reaches 100%, you will get a translation. So that's the reason why we have this schema order. So after we have defined our schemas, we can move this. We want to start modifying how the database will be set up and how this CRUD system operations will be done. So the pseudocode for it will look like something like defining that within our task, we will have a CRUD file that will hold all of our operations, all of our methods for doing create, read, update, delete operations. And we will call this function, we can call it create translation task. So we don't have this yet, but we will create it in a second. And this function will have certain parameters. So we can have 2 parameters, or 3 parameters, because it will also have the languages X, Y, Z, P. Then we will add it to the background tasks. And this is something that I believe is fundamentally important to understand in order to proceed. So we will go to the browser and read something about the documentation. So I just want to make sure that you know where to look for to understand this particular technology. So if you go on Google and type in FastAPI documentation, and in the search bar you want to look for background tasks. So this is where you'll be able to find all the documentation related to this particular concept. You can use it to schedule the execution of background tasks after the response is sent. And you can pretty much see where I'm going with this. So I want to be able to have my web app process these asynchronous tasks. So by all means, if you need any further familiarization, open this particular document and you can find all the details you need there. In the meantime, now we'll go back to our code. So we want to now add, whilst we are creating the translation, so this is our create translation function, which we still have not created, we'll create it now. We are going to add to the background tasks, a task, we'll do perform translation task ID and the request variables. So request text and request languages, and we'll pass DB again. And we will return, as we said, the return schema. As we said, for what we decided to return to the user would just be the ID. So now to create, we don't need this. So now to create these methods. So we want to go in our CRUD file and create this method for creating translation tasks. And then we're going to deal with our perform translation method for our background tasks. So we can copy this and we'll go into our CRUD file. And from here, you want to import SQL Alchemy at the session. And we'll import models because this is how we will fill out our tables. But we'll build the database after this. First, let's define this method. So you can copy paste the name, and this will have a connection to our database, and it will take, as we said, there are 3 parameters: database and then the payloads components. So this will be languages, which is a list, and we want to say the task is a models translation task. And languages are languages. So after that, we want to go into our DB session and use it to the base. Every time you do that, you need to do commit and refresh. So this is how SQL Alchemy, this particular ORM, handles this. This will be always a part of any CRUD operation. But I'm going to pass the task here and say return task. Then the second method we want is the method that will fetch the translation task. It will also be able to go into the database and work with the ID. That's an integer, and it will just return the query according to the ID that we pass it. So it will go translation task, and you want to pass this. So models translation task ID. So find the models that has the ID same as the ID that we passed in this parameter and return the first touch. And then the last thing we want in our CRUD operations methods will be to update the translation task. So once again, this part will be the same. So I can copy paste this from above. But this now returns the translations as well. So if you remember when we actually had our diagram, I'm going to pull it up so you can see exactly where, in this method, where they appear on our diagram. So take it in mental memory for now. This is method number 1 and this is method number 2. So if you remember our not so good looking diagram here, when we were talking about the backend processing this particular payload. So the method, number 1, is the payload that has the text and the languages as a parameter. So they will still share the same ID. The red text here and the blue text here representing 2 different aspects that work within the same table. So this is all one table, but on 2 different instances we are doing a either create or update request to it. So in the red one, which corresponds to our, when I said red, I'm referring to this line here. It corresponds with our first method here, create translation task. And this line, so this particular sequence of event here is just updating the translation, so adding the translation. So that's the update, and it needs the ID parameter to know where to add that translation to, because it's returning after. So these are two separate events that are operating in the same table. So as you can see, we need to pass task ID so that it knows how to find the table where it will chuck in the translation of this text here from the first function and in the languages of the first function. So I hope that's clear, and that's quite important to understand for this particular type of system. So we'll say that the task, it can go and find according to the ID. So it will filter models, and it will be the same way of querying like the one above. And then we want to say tools translations, and the status now changes to completed. And again, after every CRUD operation, you want to do commit and refresh and return task. And that's it for our CRUD operations. We won't have to open this anymore, I believe. Now we want to create our database. So we're going to talk about how to set up this database and create our table. So first, you want to go into your database.py. In here, you want to import OS. You want to import create engine from SQL Alchemy Session Maker. And in order to keep our variables safe, the ones that contain sensitive data, that's important. Here, you want to import .env, load.env. So we will load this .env, and what this means. So what that means, you want to go in the main directory. So if you go print working directory inside here, so you want to make sure you are in your main working directory, so outside of the main app folder, and we will do touch.env. And in this file, we will have our database URL, and we will have our OpenAI key. So for now, you can leave this empty, but this will be the file that will hold your sensitive information, and then we're going to load this file with our dependency here, .env. So that will allow us to say OS, using the import OS library, get env, and then particular variable called database URL, which you can see corresponds with this here. So this is the way you keep it safe. Then below that, you want to say that the engine is create engine, and we will pass the parameter of the previously defined connection string sensitive information that we stored in our .env file. So it travels all the way through this in such manner. And lastly, we want to add the session maker. I'm not sure does this have to be here, but for now, let it remain. I doubt that it can hurt. So that's all we need for our database.py. We'll move on to our models.py, where we will be defining our table. So you want to import these from SQL Alchemy. So column, integer, string, text, and JSON. Those will help us create different types of data types in our database. And then after that, you want to get declarative base from this particular dependency, also SQL Alchemy. So here we will call base declarative base. And now we will create our table. So we'll say that the translation task creates a table called translation tasks. And now we will actually define all the rows. So we'll say that the ID is a column, which will be an integer and a primary key, true. And we'll have text, which is type text, nullable false. So it can't be empty. And we'll do that for languages, but languages are a list. So that will be a JSON here. And there will be status, which is a column string, and the default is in progress. So if you remember, we only had to, in our CRUD file, we only had to have an alternative of can be changed to completed now, because here we can set the default to be in progress. And then we are adding the translations finally. That's a JSON, and the default is just an empty JSON. And that's our models.py. I don't think we will need to go back to this, but I'll still leave this open because I might have to talk about it a bit later. So now we can go to our main.py and write a cleaner version of this. So you want to go to the top and import the CRUD file. And now this function actually exists. We just created it, so we can pass the genuine parameters. So this will be the database, this will be the text parameter of the request, and this will be the languages parameter of the request. So the only thing missing within these parameters is our DB. So you will go here above the course, and we will define this function. Actually, we can define this in our database file. So we can say getDB. I'm sure you can copy paste this just from the FastAPI documentation, but I have it here in front of me as well. So we can say try yield this DB. So this now turns into a generator, db close. And then we will import this. So if we go back to main py, we can say from database import. Now we should be able to use this. If we say db. So now moving on to our background tasks. So for this, we'll have to write some utility functions. So these are the functions that we want to give to our background tasks process to handle asynchronously. Oh, we want to make sure that this is called the same. Here is getDB. So we want to create a new file here. We'll call it utils.py. And what we're going to do now is create this function that will perform the translation. But before that, there is one thing that I forgot. We want to make sure that a database is created. So if you go here above app, you want to paste this part. So you want to say models.base metadata creates all and then bind the engine. And we will import models. And also from database, we want to import the engine. So now once we start the main file, each time our FastAPI loads up the server, it will make sure that a certain database exists and that a table that's defined in our models exists. If it doesn't, it's going to create it. So next thing we'll do is create our database in pgadmin4. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by showing you how to download pg and admin4 from internet. Just Google it, download it, configure it. You will get a username and a password once you configure it, and then you will see in your server cluster, you can create a database by clicking right click on databases, create database, and give it a name. So I'm going to give it the name translation service. You'll just click save and that's it. You have your database. If you go under schemas and tables, if you click refresh here, you'll see that there are no tables, which is good. We will create that from Python. And this is the beauty of using an ORM, which is SQL Alchemy in this case. So what we have to do is define it here, and this particular table name with this name will be created once we load our server. So in order now to connect your database to this particular project, you want to go in your .env and your username and password will go here. This is the address and this is the name of the database. So once again, here you're defining what SQL. Here you are giving the username. This is the password. This is the address, and obviously we are working locally, so this is localhost. If you're deploying this project, these will be credentials of your actual provider. And then the translation service is the database. So this is the database name over there. So this is pretty self-explanatory. I have no doubts that you can configure this successfully. Once you have done that, you will go back to your VS Code. We can delete this. And now we are ready to launch our server, and this should automatically create our table as well. So if you go in the main folder and run this line, one thing before I move on, we need to also make sure that we install this. So I've added it in our requirements.txt, but if you need to individually install it, do pip install this particular library, the last one here. So after you've done that, you go in your terminal, working directory, and you run recon main app reload. So everything is running. And now if you go back to your pgadmin4 and refresh the tables, you will see that the translation tasks table has appeared. So now we know that our database is connected, our server is running, and we can finish the backend by writing the utility functions. So just to remind you of where we are, if you go into your main.py, you'll remember that when we were writing our endpoint, we defined this background tasks process, and the task that we added was supposed to be a function called perform translation. So now we're going to actually write that function, that method in our utility.py. So here you want to import OpenAI from SQL Alchemy ORM. You want to import session to be able to connect to the database. From our CRUD file, you want to import the update translation task, and from our environment, you want to import load function and also OS. Here we will pass the API key for our OpenAI. We'll use OS to fetch the environment. And we'll say that this variable is called OpenAI API key. To make sure this is connected, you have to go in your .env file and you have to put in the API key in a variable called OpenAPI key, like such. I'm going to do that off screen. So you just copy paste your OpenAPI key here or any other LLM you want to use, but I'll be using OpenAPI. So once you do that, you click save and we move on. So when you finish setting up your environment for sensitive data, we can write our function. So we'll say that perform translation takes parameter of task ID, so the integer, and the text is string, and languages will be a list. And we also want to get DB session. We'll say that translations are an empty dictionary, and write a for loops saying for each element in the languages list, try giving in the response OpenAI chat completion and create. Model will be GPT-4, and the messages will be a list, an F string that says this, or a helpful assistant that translates text into and then the language of each language. That'll work. And underneath that, we'll do role, the user content, and then the text. You give a comma here, and we'll say that the max tokens are 1,000, but you can adjust this based on your own needs. So then we will get the translated text, and we'll give it in the response. So that's a 0, and here we'll write some formatting because we're dealing with a list, and we'll give our translations then of each language to be translated text. And we want to do some debugging as well. Oh, in the meantime, I forgot. You want to go above and load the environment variable. And here I made a typo, so this is max tokens like such. And now we will write this exception. So our exception will print that if there was an error, we will get the error back so we can see. And we can play around with this if we end up actually having some errors. But for now, we'll just leave it as such. And now we want to call this function the update translation task. So if you click on the update translation task and click F12, it will take you back to your CRUD file. So you can remind yourself of what this actually does. So we have already written this function. We are just invoking it here now to perform that task. So we will say update translation task. It will have a parameter of DB to connect to the database, and then update the database by finding the particular ID and inserting the translations into the table. So we save this, and we just now need to finish our endpoints, and that'll be the end of our backend. So I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. We'll take the core stuff and just put it above our endpoints. So I forgot to pass the background tasks as a parameter. So in our translate function here, we want to add the background tasks. So I've inserted here between the schemas and the DB session. So add the to be background tasks with a capital B, and then we want to add the connection to the database. So we will say that variable DB is session depends get DB, and then we don't need this get DB variable. So in this line 43, delete get DB, and do the same for this line 42 in task. First thing after parentheses, delete this as well. And now we need to import session. So if you go on top and we do from SQL Alchemy import session. And that's sqlalchemy.orm import session. So we will now write the utility functions for our search functionality, and this will be fairly similar. So it will be a get request. So I copied the previous endpoint. I'm just going to modify it. So this one will go, this get request will have a task ID parameter, and the schema is not going to be task response. Delete that and put translation status. Delete all of these parameters other than DB, and here we will pass in task ID to be an integer, and then just have the connection with the database. Here in the task, we will go into our CRUD file, and we will get, I feel like there's a typo here, but we can still get the exact text. So get the translating task, DB task ID. This line of code we can delete, and underneath the task, we'll say if nothing returns in task, or better said, if task returns empty. So if task is null, we want to raise an exception. So we'll put in HTTP exception, and we'll give it a status code of 404 with the detail of task not found. But if task is not null, then we want to return task ID and the status, which is the task.status. So it will access that parameter and return entry from the database. And the translation will be the variable translation. So again, we'll access the task translations. And then we want to do practically the same thing, but for content. So this particular endpoint will correspond to, let me show you exactly what. So it will correspond exactly to check status button. And then now we're going to write the function that will be an endpoint that gets executed once we click check content. So we can copy this and we'll slightly modify it. We can change the endpoint address. So we'll say that this is content/task ID. And I forgot one thing. We want to change the name. So it goes back to the previous function. For me, that's line 60. And here we will just say get translate because they have to be called differently. The first one is called translate. The second one then should be called get translate. And the third one can be called get translate content, something like that. As long as they have unique names, it's fine. And this will remain all the same. The task line will also remain the same. And this will remain same as well. But when we return, we do not need to return the ID. We just want to return the task altogether. And that should be it. So I believe this is all we need for our backend to work. But now we can go and try running this. So if we save and give it a first test. So we put some text here. We will say, hello there, how are you? And we will say that we want to translate this to French, German, and Italian. And we will click translate. And we get error. Please provide both text and target language. So this means there is some kind of a problem with the logic that's supposed to confirm that there actually is content here. So to troubleshoot this, I'm going to start from the beginning. I need to check what's wrong with this button. Is this button actually picking up, extracting the data from here? So let's try opening the developer resources. We'll go into console. In the console, I want to be able to see. So if I do a console log or something, I want to be able to see a particular result. Let me see, can I zoom in on this, make it a bit larger? That should work for now at least. Hello, pasting. That's too much of text. So we'll say that constant text, and we want to get element by this particular text. So now if I do console log text, and I can see that it does extract the text from here. So that's not an issue. And if I do constant languages, and the ID for this are languages, and I do value, and we put in languages here, I get this. So that's not an issue. Next, I want to make sure that this button actually does what it's supposed to. So what I'm going to try to do is go to my HTML file and find the code for the button. So if we go into our app and we'll open templates, HTML, and we want to find a line that declares the button for submit. So in our line 46, on click is submit translation. If I do an F12 on this, it takes me to my function. This is the code that we tested, so we know that code worked. So the console logging that we just did in the console. And I think I can see a typo here. So after this, we need these two. So I believe I just omissed these particular bit of characters. So I've saved that. We are rerunning our server and let's try it again. And then I realized I made a silly typo with response.openai. It should be response equals. I'll go to network. And I want to see what happens when I try to make this request, and I can see nothing happens. So all of the GET requests here are fine. But if I do hello to German and I want to do this, nothing happens. So my first idea how to troubleshoot this, I just want to make sure that all of the backend now works properly. So I'm going to use Postman to just quickly test the backend. So if you go into Postman and you provide the endpoint address, so that's our 8000 ports / translate, and we give it this particular payload and we click send, we get 422 unprocessable entity. So there is an error with our backend. So we are just catching some errors. I realized that I forgot to pass the variable for the API key. So if you go into your utils.py, underneath this, we want to make sure that we have given the API key properly. So make sure this particular line, the line number 10, is present. Also, I made an error here. So indentation error, this function should be outside of this particular except. So it is outside of this for loop. So make sure you align it with the for loop. All right, we'll continue troubleshooting. We'll make sure that languages is written properly. So I misspelled it here. It's written atrociously. So make sure you fix that too. If you go back to the models.py and instead of that was written languages here, make sure that this is written correctly. So now in order to update this, unfortunately, this ORM SQL Alchemy cannot do migrations dynamically like this. So we'll have to go to our Postgres database in pgadmin4 and manually delete the tables and restart everything. So we will go to translation tasks, delete, click OK. Now when we go back to our server and click save, it should create a new one. So if we refresh, we see translation tasks, and I want to open it to make sure that in my columns the languages is written correctly now, and as you can see it is. So to double check, triple check actually, from schemas to the main py, we want to make sure that every time we have languages it's written correctly, there are no typos or nothing like that. And after that I need to check how did I write the names of the methods in case I misspelled when re-referencing them in other places. So I'm going to open main.py and utils and crud next to each other, and then we'll make sure that all of them are named the way they should be. So in our utils, this is perform translation, that's fine. But then in our main.py, we want to make sure that in our first function that we are calling create translation task. And if we click on it and press F12, it will lead us to a CRUD operation, so that's fine. In our second use method, this is supposed to lead to the second CRUD operation, and that's fine as well. So you want to make sure that these are aligned, and the third one should lead to, again, the second CRUD operation as well. So if that's all correct, let's try running the server and see are there any further bugs that we need to fix. So we are running the FastAPI server again. So it looks like it is online. Let's check what happens when we try to send a request. So I've tried sending this and we got an error which says that there was an error translating to French and German. So this means that we did get payload delivered to our FastAPI web service, but the follow-up with our background tasks did not manage to get a return from our translation service. So now we know where to go and troubleshoot. How silly of me, I forgot that we left two functions untouched and we need to finish them. My plan was to do it at the end, but I did end up forgetting to do them all together. So let's go back to our front end and make sure that we have those functions written. So if we open our index.html, so in our first function that will check for the translation status, so that will be our first button in our search functionality. We want to add constant ID, which will be document get element by ID, and this will be the ID of search ID, and we want to get the value of that stored in table ID. So we'll do try, we'll have a constant response, which will be our Axios function that will execute a get to our local host. Let me just copy paste this particular link. So you want to do the same. Brackets. So this is your link. This is our endpoint on our FastAPI. After this, we're going to say that our translation result is data from response. So whatever is received from this endpoint will be stored in response, and we are accessing that data. After that, we'll be using get element by ID for translation results. So we want to get the text content of that. Are we going to stringify that? Then we want to also get element by ID with ID results, and the style display for that will be block. After, we want to display translation status, and we'll do that again by using get element by ID, and we'll target the status result. And with this, the text content will change to status, give it a $, translation result status. And we'll close this. And again, we want to change this one to block. Also, we want to catch an error, so we know that if we need to do debugging, we can actually see what's going on, what's gone wrong. So we'll do console error fetching translation status, and we'll print the error. So log the error, and we can give an alert that says that there was an error while fetching the translation status, and try again. So that's our first function, and then we want to have the function for the second button. So this will be the on-click for the second button on our page when we actually want to display the entire content of a particular historic entry in our database. So a translation we did before. And again, just like in the above function, we can copy paste the const ID, which will be get element by ID, search ID, so exact same line like in the function above. And we're going to use the same structure of saying try and defining the response to execute a GET request. But with the previous one, endpoint was /translate ID. This one is content ID. So it corresponds exactly to this endpoint. So the first function, calls a GET request to this endpoint, this one will be called by our second function that we are writing right now. So again, we want to stringify this. And with the second element, we want to change the style to block. So I'm going to copy paste the code for that. And if you need to, you can pause and rewrite the code yourself or play around a bit to understand how we are accessing these elements with get element by ID, typing in the actual ID of the HTML element, dot text content, and stringifying the JSON. Just realized I don't need the return for this. So if you go above to the first function, you can delete the return. Same for the second function. And we will just finish off writing the statement for our try. And we can just add catch error just as we did in the previous function. So you can copy paste this entire bit. And if we save this, we can check, do we have any bugs after this? So if you need to, feel free to pause, look at the code for these two functions. This is the final version of them. And this is all that our index.html file needs in terms of JavaScript. So feel free to pause and make sure your code is updated with all of this. So another silly typo. In our models.py, you want to add the S. So it's not translation, it's translations. We'll save that and try running everything again. And now we have the issue that comes with SQL Alchemy, just working with an ORM like SQL Alchemy. So we are not able to modify these tables dynamically. We have to delete everything effectively and then restart, recreate a new table again, and then it will be updated to this new name for the column. So if you open your PG admin and you go into your tables, translation task, and if you delete this table, and now if you rerun the whole thing, you can go back into your tables and refresh this, and there will be a brand new translation tasks table. So if you query for the last all rows, you can see that the table is empty. So a brand new table has been created. We'll go to crud.py and make sure that all of our methods here are named grammatically correct. So you want to change the middle one. I believe it had the missing, which one was it? So it was get translating. So we can change all of that and just put get translation task for the middle one. So feel free to pause and compare this crud.py file to the current one you have. Make sure it's written exactly like you see here, and we can move on. So we need to go to our main py and make sure that just how we have everything written in crud.py, the functions are written the exact same way in our main py. So we can open them one next to another. So if we open crud on the right hand side and we have main py on the left hand side. So let's see now. In our post request, we are using create translation task, and that's correct here. In our get endpoint for our task ID, we are using get translating task. So this is the one that we just changed. So we will copy this name, and here we'll change into get translation task. And the same thing goes for our third method here. We want to put get translation task. We'll save that. I believe we also need to go to our imports and make sure that from database we import session local next to engine. We also want to import list from typing, and we will import UUID. So just to make sure we don't get any errors in regards to that, we'll move on now. And in our third method, we deleted, so there's no need for this response model. That's not going to give translation status. So you want to do this. So after we deleted that, we also want to make sure that we return the task, not as an object, but as a variable here. And that was the last of our errors. I believe there was a good 5 to 10 errors that we had to fix at the end. Some of them just being typos, some of them being logical errors. And we will go and test our app now. So we want to go to our browser. We will access our endpoint for rendering the main page. And we will put some text here. Hello, how are you today? And let's say we want this in French, German, and Italian. And if we click translate, we are given an ID, so it's an ID 6. We can see that translation is in progress. We got the results, so we see now progress bar in action. Translation is complete. So now we want to maybe check. Let's first check, did this land in our database? So if we go into our PG admin and we refresh this by going into show me all rows, you can see here at the bottom that we do have the recent request, the languages, the status being complete, and we have the translations here. So what was the ID for that? It was number 6. So if we put enter translation ID 6 and check status, we see that status is complete. If we do check content, we get the entire content of the translation request. Let's try doing something much bigger. So I'm going to just try going to a random Wikipedia page or something like that. So let's say I type in, I don't know, Vivaldi, and let's try to take a big chunk of Vivaldi's page from Wikipedia. And if we put Vivaldi's Wikipedia and request the translation into French, German, Italian, and Portuguese, so this should take considerably longer. So now we want to see this asynchronous nature of our web app in action. So this is task ID 7. So we got our confirmation that the progress has been received. And as we wanted now, we can see that asynchronously, the background tasks from FastAPI is running the second process of translating the task. And we already have our 200. So even if we go back in our VS Code, we can see that we have our get translate every 1 second going as a OK, which is what we wanted. So we are still waiting for this. We are waiting for the OpenAI API to return the translation for us. So let's see how long it takes. So it's been 2 or 3 minutes, and as you can see, we still didn't get our request back. And if I go back to my VS Code, you can see that the polling that we defined to be 1000 milliseconds, it's doing its job. Every 1 second, it's constantly refreshing and wanting to get that payload back so that it can display it to the user. Like we said, we don't want the user to have to do anything on the page. The page should dynamically update. So the translation finally came back. It took a good couple of minutes, and we can see that everything is updated on our page. If we want to check now the status of it, and we put number 7, check status, we did see that the status is complete, and same thing for content, we can retrieve it on our page. And that's it, that's our project. I hope you enjoyed it, you learned something, and I'll see you next time. So the next project we will do will be this AI-powered content generator and analyzer. And the idea behind this project is more to explain how the infrastructure of a similar project can be produced. This particular content generator is not exactly what I consider to be some kind of high quality product output, but it's there to teach you how to actually implement this type of a system. And then you can easily create or modify a custom version of it for yourself if you're actually trying to build something like this. Or if not, this project itself will be sufficient to just master these concepts. So like before, we will do an explanation of the project that we will build. I'll use a diagram and also show you the project itself, how it works. So the important aspects that I wanted to include in this project was how to approach this situation when you have multiple tasks that you want your service to run, and then utilizing Python's multi-threading built-in library. And this is very, very important where you actually want to build something more sophisticated. So the first thing we will touch upon is Python's multi-threading and semaphores, which will help optimize the performance, especially when dealing with this input-output bound tasks like making API calls or database operations. So by incorporating multi-threading and semaphores, you can optimize the performance of your application. Important to note this bit here. This approach helps manage concurrent requests efficiently. So you can imagine, as you build a system like this, if you're dealing with what you will see here, you're not really increasing the overall performance of it, but as your system scales, this becomes so efficient. So you're improving the overall responsiveness of the system as it scales. So there is much on multi-threading that can be discussed about, and this video will be more about the implementation of it rather than just theory. But in a nutshell, multi-threading will allow multiple threads to run concurrently. So lastly, with semaphore, it is a synchronization primitive that controls access to a common resource by multiple threads. And in this project, semaphore is used to limit the number of concurrent API requests to the OpenAPI, preventing overload and managing rate limits effectively. So we will implement it in our utils.py file. You saw at this point we kind of approach this file structure in a similar way for each project, and we always have this utils.py file where we include additional function aspect that is running our main.py file. So this is where we will do our semaphore initialization. So for now we will do just 5 concurrent threads. So what is it used for? The semaphore usage block shows that each thread acquires the semaphore before making an API call. And this is the important part. After a certain threshold, additional threads will wait until one of the current threads releases the semaphore. So we will have these 2 functions that will use semaphore. In our main.py file, we'll have our thread pool executor, and this manages the thread pool and executes the utility functions in separate threads. I'm going to leave this explanation here pause it. There's no need for me just to read it out loud. Just by all means, pause the video and read this explanation for it. Moving on. So before we analyze the diagram that will explain our project, I'm going to go back to the actual project itself and show you how it works. So the idea is that you can enter any topic. So for example, if I was to enter right now Super Bowl and click generate content, this is now making a request call to OpenAI, and we receive some generic text that explains Super Bowl. And the idea is that by modifying this additionally, you can have this very quick one-button generated content on a topic of your request. So furthermore, our project here will have an ability to analyze the text, and we have two parameters, readability and sentiment. As you can see, since this is AI generated, the text coming back has quite a good readability score. But what's more important here is that it can actually comment on the sentiment of the text. So here I'm providing you the template of how you can utilize sentiment analysis for any particular purpose. Let's say you wanted to do Twitter post analysis. If you were to query each individual tweet, post, however you call it, it will give you the sentiment analysis of that, and you get like positive, neutral, negative. So you can see this objective commentary on what Super Bowl is. So it correctly states that the sentiment of the text is neutral. If I was to go in a different direction, let's say we go through for a historic event, World War II casualties, click generate content. So now we have this text that speaks about the casualties in World War II. And if I go now and copy paste this into the box for content analysis and click analyze content, now the sentiment of the text is negative, so clearly because it discusses the casualties in a war. Let's say I try to do something like successful operation. So this is just some kind of like to create a successful operation and then some key factors. And then because this is kind of positive advice on how to approach whatever, long story short, we can see that the sentiment of the text is positive. So our app works like intended, and we'll just break it down to this diagram of how things actually occur. So as you saw, we have this user interface, which is our web app. So this is our first part here. I will segment it like so and say this is number one. And this is just our HTML elements. As you see, it's a simple HTML page. There's just a little bit of bootstrap here to make the buttons look slightly more modern, but nothing special. I think I generated it with ChatGPT. So this triggers our JavaScript. So if you go back to this page and we look into the source, so if you look into the source and look at the JavaScript, you'll see there's a little bit of JavaScript here, which is basically just a couple of functions that will extract this text and forward it to our FastAPI app. So that's the JavaScript that we use here. So let's say this JavaScript could kind of our number 2 stage. So now our data will land with our FastAPI backend. So with our FastAPI backend, we will include a schema validation. So that's not written anywhere here, but this definitely will start our stage 3. It starts with schema validation that makes sure the data that JavaScript forwarded with fetch method reaches our endpoints. And we will have 2 endpoints. So as you can see, we have generate endpoint and analyze endpoint, respectively representing 2 of the each input boxes, one giving an option for content generation and the other is the sentiment analysis. So the important part, which I will segment maybe as number 4, is the calls to the thread pool executor. So this is us controlling the processes and making sure that they run sequentially in a specific order and that the 6th one would not start before the semaphore actually allows it to. So after that, I would say that what we do have then is communicating with OpenAI API to retrieve the sentiment analysis, and then we can store it in a database. This is just the addition to consistently practice incorporating this Postgres database aspect of all of these projects. So we can store our content or sentiment analysis into a database. This will be our Postgres, and then it returns the data retrieval for displays. And then, as you saw, we get it back in our HTML page. So just to briefly comment on when and where multi-threading and semaphore are used, because I believe this is effectively the reason why this project should be studied. So the trigger, user submits the form to generate content. And so this is the endpoint. So when we submit payload to this particular endpoint, the thread pool handles the request concurrently and uses semaphore to limit the number of concurrent API calls. And so, like I said, this is our first part, generate content. And then Let me put like 1 and then 2 here. So the second one is when we do sentiment analysis, and what for is submitting the analyze content function to the thread pool to handle the request concurrently, just like with the previous one. So we use it for the same purpose in these 2 endpoints. By all means, also read this summary. It's useful information. And like I've said, it's very important that you are quite comfortable with dealing with multi-API requests concurrently and making order with a very unorganized situation, which could be a system that scales upwards. So, semaphore. So that all being said, we went through our diagrams, some theory, and we can go and start writing some code. So you want to go to this particular GitHub repo. It'll be the link, the first link you see under the project. And you want to go and clone the repo. So you're going to copy URL and just go into your working directory and git clone this link. So we start together with the same file structure that you can see on the left-hand side in this video. So after you have done the git clone, you will have the app folder, templates folder, and .env.gitignore.requirements.txt. So first thing you want to do is create a virtual environment and activate the virtual environment, pip install all of this. So I already have that running in a different window, but I'm just going to give you a quick introduction on how to do that. I believe in the previous 2 videos we have done that. So you want to make sure that you're in the right folder. So the working directory, you will do Python and mvenv and then the name. So once you have this, you want to activate this particular environment. So in PowerShell, I like to do it in PowerShell. So that will be scripts ps1 like so, and you can see the prefix .venv, meaning that we have activated our virtual environment. We want to install all of these libraries. So what I'm going to do is pip install our requirements.txt. So you just leave this to run, and within a couple of minutes you will have all of the dependencies ready to be used. So in your .env, you want to make sure that you have your sensitive data. So we will not hard code any of the sensitive data in our app code. Rather, we will use a particular dependency that allows us to use them in a safe way. So you want to make sure that your OpenAI API key is copy pasted here. And also with this project, we will be doing a database implementation. So you want to create a database with Postgres. And for that, I use pgadmin4. So if you open pgadmin4 in databases here, you want to create a database. And as you can see, I already created this AI gen database. So you do the same and make sure that then in your .env, you write this particular variable, database URL. So we will say that we are using Postgres, and then you want to put username, password, the address, which will be localhost port 5432, which is the bold one, and then the last slash is the name of the database. You do the exact same format. And like I've said above, you just copy paste your API key from OpenAI dashboard. So that's all you need for your .env file. Right, we're moving on. So we can see that all of our dependencies have been successfully installed. So we can start coding our app. So the first thing we'll do is create our files. So we will create a main.py. We will have a crud.py, database.py, utility, schemas, and models. So these are all the files that we'll need in our app folder. And just before we start writing the backend logic, I will quickly skim over the front-end stuff. Front-end stuff is not relevant for this project, so you should just use it from the git clone provided with the description. But just to briefly skim over what's going on here, so the bootstrap we are using it through the link. There is some CSS styling just to make this project work in the way we want it to work. You have your standard HTML which gives us forms, so we can take the input from the user, and the submit form will then execute some JavaScript. The JavaScript itself is nothing more than a fetch function that will take the payload, do a post request, send it to a specific endpoint, which in this case will be our FastAPI endpoint. I believe that's sufficient in terms of how much we need to talk about the front end. Back to us coding our backend now. So first things first, I like to kind of get the generic stuff that we always do in the same way out of the way. So what we'll do, we'll go into database.py. So we will import what we need here. So we are using SQL Alchemy. So the dependency injections will be done with these particular variables, and write these. Also use OS because we'll be working with files, and what we said earlier, we are using .env to store our sensitive data. So the dependency that will enable us to use that is .env. So make sure you import that. We want to load this environment, so we'll say load.env, and then we want to import our variables that store our sensitive data. So we'll say that the database URL is, and then we use the OS framework to actually access that file. So get environment, and the name of it is database URL. So now we want to create the SQL Alchemy engine, and we will say that the engine is just create engine, and we are passing the database URL. So creating a configured session class, session local. So we have session maker, and we'll pass these 3 parameters. And then at the end, we'll say that the base equals declarative base. So this is our database.py, and we can close it. We're not going to need to open this anymore. So for our main.py now, we'll go there, and we'll first deal with the imports. So we want to use these 3 from FastAPI. To be able to render our HTML page, we want to import this particular templates, and we are importing our ORM, which is SQL Alchemy session. And we want to make sure that we can work with all of the files from our app folder. So we are importing models, CRUD, database, utility, and schema. So these are the files in the folder respectively. And we want to make sure that from database, we import engine and session local. And lastly, from starlet concurrency, we import run in thread pool. We'll write models.base.metadata create all to bind the engine, and call our app, which is the FastAPI, so store it in app variable. We want to make sure that this app knows where to look for our template files. So to be able to render the HTML file, the front end, we want to say that go and look into the templates folder. So that's the directory where we'll store our front end stuff, which is, if you look at the left hand side where the file structures are, you can see where our HTML file is right there. So to do dependency injection next, we can use the same thing. So I always copy paste this from the actual website. To get our dependency injections, we'll just be passing this getDB parameter with our endpoint methods. So lastly, now we can actually write our endpoints. So the main endpoint will just read our HTML page and render it. So that's what it does. We'll name it accordingly. Read root. It has a request, and the return is just template response, giving the template that we have there. Now we wanna. So we said we will have 2 endpoints that will effectively do all the work. So that'll be our post endpoint on /generate. So this is for generating content, and we want to asynchronously define this method. We're calling it generate content, and we are making sure that the data that travels from the front end is validated by our schemas. So we still have not written this. So now we'll go into schemas and make sure that the request body that comes gets validated by this particular parameter from schemas and stores in payload variable here. So this is how we will access the data that goes onto this particular endpoint. And then the second parameter is our dependency injection. And as you saw, we defined that here. So this is what allows us to actually have the connection to the database. But like we said, we have our payload here, and we need to make sure that it gets validated. And I always like to just use Pydantic schemas for that. So going into our schemas.py, we will import base model from Pydantic, and we will have a bunch of classes now to validate our data. So we have this one that takes the first input, which will just be a string. So it gives the topic that we want to generate content about. And then the second one for sentiment analysis, it's also a string. So we're just making sure that whatever comes, it's a particular one variable, and the data type is a string. And if you think about it, do we really need schemas at this point? No, not really. But as this tutorial kind of aims to teach the basic architecture structure of a particular web app that functions like this, we try to establish it as a practice, as a habit, as a good practice of creating high standard of API systems. So after we have our schemas, we'll go back to our main.py. And under generated text, we will store what this particular method returns. So as we mentioned earlier, we are importing this run in thread pool from starlet.concurrency. And the parameters we are passing is a particular function from utility, our dependency injection, and the topic from the payload. So this third parameter is what comes from the front end, the input from the user. The dependency injection is our connection to the database, and the one that we still have not written is the generate content function from utility. So that's what we'll do next. So if we go into utility.py, we want to make sure we import everything that we need. So you want to import OpenAI OS. Just like with the other files, we're importing session and loading our sensitive data in load.tnv. We're using CRUD and models files from our app file, from our app folder. We are importing threading and thread pool executor. Once again, we want to establish the connection to our sensitive data. We will be using the OpenAI key. So this is how you're going to do that. Just like with the database URL, we are establishing that here. And what I consider to be the pivotal moment of this particular project is to explain that here is the moment we define a semaphore to limit the number of concurrent threads. So just for this example, we are doing a particular number 5. So we'll be running 5 threads. And then if there is a 6th one, it actually waits for one of these to finish. So now we want to write our generate content function. So what we'll do is have it with our dependency injection and the topic, the string that gets passed from the front end, and the return will be a string as well. So with semaphore, we'll say that the search term is crud.getSearchTerm, and this will have the 2 parameters of the dependency injection and the topic. And as you can see, we still have not touched our crud.py file. So we need to make sure now we have this particular method written in our crud.py. Going to our crud.py, we will just import these 2 particular lines, and then we'll write our create search term method. So it will have the same parameters, and we're going to say that the tb search term is models search term, which is the term. So as you can see now, as we are creating this flow, we are kind of jumping from a file to file, but I believe it's important that you have an idea of how the thought process usually is when you are creating these endpoints and modifying specific utility, adding functionality to it. So now we'll go into our models and write our tables. So going into models.py, we want to import a couple of things. So from SQL Alchemy, we'll import this particular column, integer, string, foreign key, and text. We'll import relationship because we'll be using a relational concept when it comes to creating these tables. And our first table will be our search terms. So we want to store that. So we'll say that the table name is search terms. And this is how I've generated this. So it will have an ID. The ID is the primary key. The term, which is what gets passed from the user. And then we have the generated content that returns to be displayed in the front end aspect for the user. And also we have sentiment analysis. So this is what we're storing in our database called search terms. Then our second table is called generated content. And this takes from a particular line from the table we just created previously, our search terms table. And it also has its own ID, this the content. And then we have the search term ID and the search term, which has the relationship with the search term table. And our third table for sentiment analysis, it also has ID, readability, sentiment. So these are the outputs that you saw in our front-end app are returned to the user when they do sentiment analysis. And we are also storing the ID and the search term in this table. So that's our models.py. If you need to, you can just pause and make sure that you have written this in the same way. I'm going to make sure that everything is visible in a way that you can just pause and go over it. So I believe now in the video, if you pause, everything is visible. So going back to where we were. So as you can see, if you look at the files that are open here, main, CRUD, utility, schemas, and models, this was the workflow whilst we were trying to write this endpoint. So we can effectively close them one by one and go where we were. So the last one that we were working on was utility.py, and we will finish off writing our generate content function. So if this is null, we'll say that the search term, if this is not null, CRUD create search term, and this has the same 2 parameters. So now we want to make sure that we can actually access the OpenAI API. So in our response variable, we will store OpenAI.chatCompletion, and we will write these particular parameters. So what's getting passed to OpenAI is your be my assistant and write a detailed article about, and we are passing the topic that the user has chosen. We will store that in generated text, and we will say is that generated text equals response choices with index 0 and the message content. we'll use strip to do some formatting of the string. And we want to access now in our CRUD, create generated content, and pass the dependency injection generated text and search term.id. So this is now a method that we still have not created. So we'll go to our crud.py and create this method. So going back there, we see that we still have not finished our create search term method. So what we just need to add here is these 3 lines, which is the way how this particular ORM, SQL Alchemy, will actually insert this data into the database. It always needs a commit and refresh after that. And we can just say return db search term. So that's our first method defined. And very similarly, now we are doing the create generated content method. And with this one, we'll say that the db generated content is models, and from models we get generated content, and we say that content is content. We will also add that the search term ID. We'll add the same 3 lines from above here, which allows us to actually do the insertion of data into our database. Sorry, wrong copy paste. So the one with db generated content, and at this point we'll just return db generated content. So now we can go to our utility.py, and as you can see, we are accessing this method that we have just written, create generated content. Lastly, this will return generated text. So we go back to our main.py and finish off defining our endpoint. So after generated text, we just want to return that our generated text is the variable of generated text. So I believe we have everything we need to actually test this. So this particular endpoint. So if we go and run our FastAPI app, so we'll go into folder app and we'll write uvicorn main app reload. So our app is running. So if we go and open our endpoint for rendering our HTML and we enter some kind of a topic here, so I'll just do something very random. I'll say New York and click generate content. And after approximately like 5-10 seconds, we can see that we have our results returned. So we have this information about New York. So we still now have to do the second part, which is make sure that this particular input will reach our second endpoint. So we have to create that second endpoint. All right then. So quite similar to what we have already done. So we'll just copy paste the previous post and modify what we need to modify. So instead of endpoint generate, it will be endpoint/analyze. Instead of the function called generate content, it will be called analyze content. The schemas we'll be using will be analyze payload, and the dependency injection can remain exactly the same. Then instead of just creating generated text, we are creating 2 variables. And again, we are using running thread pool, but when we reach into utility file, we'll be using analyze content variable. So as you can see, we do not have this method written yet. So that's what we'll do next. We'll go into utility.py, and now we'll create our function that can do content analysis. So call it like that, call it analyze content, because that's what we've written in our main.py endpoint. And again, we will be using semaphore. So with semaphore, we'll say that our search term is crud.getSearchTerm. So as you can see, we do not have this method. So we shall go in crud.py and write it now. So going there, we'll say that the method getSearchTerm takes 2 parameters, and they are a database session and a string called term. And it will just return from our database. So we'll use SQL Alchemy here, and we will query through our models a database table called search term, and we want to filter models search term dot term, and it will be the exact term, and we want to return the first. So we will save that and go back into our utility and see that this thing went green now, from white to green, meaning that this method can now be used. Next, we will say if this is not null, then we actually want to do a CRUD operation and create this search term. So we are entering that into our table, and we want to say that readability is the output of the getReadabilityScore method, which takes the content parameter. So we do not have this function yet, so we're going to define it here. So we're going to say that this takes content, which is the string, and it returns a string. ReadabilityScore, which is good. So this can be something you modify and play with yourself. So you can see that within utility, you can add any additional functionality. So you would actually have to find a way to connect an API that can do a readability score. So this will be your place for it. So if available, replace with actual readability API call. The one that we will use with our OpenAI is the sentiment, and we'll do get sentiment analysis. So just like we did with readability score, we will create that here. And we'll say that the get sentiment analysis takes content as a string and gives us a string output. And in this response, we will again use OpenAI's AI. So we're using ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, and this is the message just saying, be my assistant and analyze the sentiment of the following text. And we are passing the content that we have just generated previously. And you want to make sure you actually know how much tokens you're using with this. You don't want to just burn through it. So I'm limiting it to 10. After that, we will return the response of choices. And again, with some formatting using strip. Well, this indentation is not right. So you want to make sure the indentation is right. So just have a quick check over. You don't do the same mistake I just did a second ago. So now we have our get sentiment analysis function. So just to recap, this is an actual function that works properly with the readability score. You are free to improvise with this and play around, implement the readability API here. You will do it in the exact way how this is done with the sentiment analysis. So within the response variable, you will make an API call, pass it certain parameters. You can read the API documentation of your readability API and then return the response that it gives. So going back to our analyze content function, after we have done readability and sentiment analysis, we will do some CRUD operations. So we want to store all of that. And we are just saying create sentiment analysis. This is the method that we'll create right now. And the parameters we're passing is our dependency injection and the readability sentiment files, but also the ID, because if you remember, we are using a relational concept here when it comes to our tables. So now we want to create the sentiment analysis method. So going into CRUD, we will do create sentiment analysis. The parameters are the dependency injection, readability string, and the ID, which is an integer. And here we want to say that our variable called sentiment analysis, basically just like the line from our create generated content function, this one here. So it'll be very similar. So I'm just going to do that. It goes into models of sentiment analysis table, and readability is readability, and you can see where this is going, just like with the previous one, ending with adding the search term ID. Then we want to do our CRUD operation, specifically create. So we are going into the database, we are adding this particular payload, and you always have to do commit and refresh. And then it's just returning the variable that we created here. So it will return DB sentiment analysis. So we have everything we need in our CRUD, I believe now. And we can close it. To finish off our utility.py, we want to go back to where we were, which is this line. So we have just created this particular function, and as you can see, it went green. So it means it's connected, and we just want to return these two variables. So if you remember, we have this readability and sentiment, and we want to return those two. So we'll say readability and sentiment. So I believe with these four functions, we have finished our utility.py file as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that's correct. So we can close utility.py as well. Going back to our main py to finish off defining the second endpoint, the post one, we want to now return the data that we have produced with readability and sentiment. So we will just say that readability is readability, sentiment, and this will be in the form of a JSON, or it's an object, like so. So what remains now is to test the second endpoint, and if everything works, then we will also just check the CRUD operations, do they operate properly, and insert the data into our database. And if all of that works, that's our project finished. So we are saving this. Our app is running, so we will open our app and test it. We will do, for example, London, click generate content and wait. So we have some information about London, and now we want to do sentiment analysis. We expect it to be positive because this is all like superlative of London. So if we copy paste that into our analyze content and click analyze content, we see that it says that the sentiment of the text is positive. So everything works here as we want it to. Now all we want to see is if we open our pgadmin4 and check into our database, did this London information get accordingly stored in our database? So doing that, I'm going to refresh my database and going into my tables. First, I'll do search terms. So if I return all rows, and I've been testing a lot of things, as you can see, but at the bottom, you can see that there is London. So everything works right here. Doing the same for our generated content, and I do return all rows, and we see that the content text exploring the vibrant city of London. And now we want to make sure that the third analysis table also works properly, and we can see that it gives us, the last sentiment of the text is positive, which is consistent with what we just saw. So everything in this project works as we intended. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something, and we'll see you in the next one. We will create a web app that will combine the functional web application using audio processing and AI models, and it will create something kind of unique. And this is the end result, what we'll end up with. So as you can see, this is our content aspect of it, and it gives the user an option to upload any audio file they want. For all intents and purposes, I'm just going to choose a random song from my computer. So I've chosen this song. You can see what it is here. For this app, I've included also Russian and Spanish. So if you want to try doing songs that are in Russian or Spanish and you want the lyrics, this is the way to do it. So after choosing all of that, we click extract lyrics. So after clicking extract lyrics, we'll have to wait for a minute or two, because now in the background we will have the following processing happen. This song, which is an MP3 file, will get converted into a WAV file. Then we'll have the lyrics extracted. As you can see, they just popped up here. Then we will communicate to OpenAI's API to have a summary of the transcribed text. So it will express the general meaning, the sentiment of it. And then the idea is that this particular summary will be forwarded as a prompt to OpenAI's API to produce an image inspired by this particular summary. So that is what the end product will look like. And now we can explain high level what is going on in the background and how this project works. So just initially, I want to show that with the file structure, what we'll be working with here is just the main PY. So we are doing the backend here. Everything else you will just get from my Git repo. I'll show you in a minute how to do that. So the front end, the index.html, the static files, these will all come from the Git repo. And then these two folders will just be there to manage all the files that we'll be working with. So irrelevant to talk about now. And you will also have to create your .env to provide the OpenAI's API key of yours. And the conventional requirements.txt is just a file that I will include in the Git repo to make sure you have all the dependencies required for your project. So like I've said, everything here is pretty much irrelevant other than our main.py. So all of this will come from the Git repo, and we will just call the main py. So on a high level, what will happen is, you saw with the front end, the user has the option to use a file. So this file, user uploads an .mp3 file. Once this particular event happens, so this is matched with this, we initiate the conversion of an mp3 file into WAV. So this particular line here. So that we will call, let's say, event number 2. So once that is completed, we initiate our audio transcription. So this is us extracting the lyrics and providing them back to the user. So let's say this is our step number 3 here. With number 4, you saw that in the summary of the transcribed text, we will extract the general meaning, the sentiment, and then provide that to the front end as well. So our backend event number 4 is the text summarization, and it provides this summarized text. So as you can see, that goes within our number 4 here, text summarization, showing the summarization of the transcribed text into a concise sentence. And then lastly, the idea at least is that we will create some kind of an image that is inspired by the lyrics of the text. So just for the sake of the project, this tutorial is supposed to teach you about this backend architecture that's kind of event driven, and it combines usage of different APIs, so API integration for a specific purpose. But you can modify this however you would like, based on what you would like as an outcome here. I just wanted to show you the way to do it. So I thought, all right, the best way maybe would be to, rather than just take the whole lyrics and try to create an image, I'll create some kind of a text summary, which we saw here with the step number 4. And then that will be the prompt to create an image out of it. Once we prompt OpenAI with this summarized text, that image will be generated and the result displayed back to the client. So to reiterate, the events we want to implement in our architecture is the following sequence. So the user uploading the MP3 file through a web interface. So in the backend then, conversion to a different file type will happen. So after this processing is complete, we will actually extract the text from the file. That text through OpenAI's API will be summarized in one concise sentence. Then we will use that to prompt OpenAI's API to generate an image, and that image will be displayed to the user. And that's the end of the sequence of events for our backend. So this is the high-level overview of our project here. With all of that being said, now we can go into implementation. So the first thing you want to do is go to the GitHub link, the following link that will be provided in the description, and it will land you in this lyrics start repo, and you want to copy this and go into your VS Code. So once you've done your git clone and you land with this exact file structure, we'll be working in this main.py and build the rest of the app. But first, before we do that, we'll go through what you get here. So you're just familiar with what's happening with the front end and the remaining of the files and folders here. So I'll go from left to bottom. So this is for now an empty folder where we will store the converted files, meaning that we will take a .mp3 file, convert it into a WAV file and store it there. With the media, this is the place where the pictures, like the images that are generated with our AI, will be stored before they are displayed on the front-end client. Static will just hold our CSS, and maybe if we want to include a logo for our front end. In the templates, we'll have our front end, like the HTML file written, and we'll go through each of the elements just to make sure, even though this project is not meant to teach front end in any way, shape or form, but we'll still go through it so that we can reference what goes where. Like as we code the backend, we want to understand why a particular function or logic from the backend is influencing something in the front end. And then with the uploads, I believe this will be the place where we store the initial chosen files, so the mp3 files. So git ignore, it's just here once I push this to git. I don't want to push some of the stuff that's sensitive or that I just don't need in a repo. And if you want to read more about the actual project, the README file here is exactly for that. It actually explains all the features of the project and the specifications, like the tech stack used, and it just gives the overall how it works. So without further ado, we will actually get the link, go back to our VS Code. You can create a new folder, it doesn't matter, but we will git clone this into your working directories. So doing git clone and giving the link of the repo. We have this folder now, so we'll cd into it. So the first thing you want to do is install everything from your requirements.txt. So just like with the other projects, we'll create a virtual environment. So this is your command for it. Let me see, maybe you can't see it over there. So python mvnv.vnv. Once you do that, you will see a new folder in your working directory .vnv. So you want to go and activate that. I prefer opening PowerShell, but it's really up to you which terminal you use to do that. So you want to make sure that you're in the folder and you want to access it all the way into scripts and then activate PS1, and this is fine. So now we have everything activated and we want to install all of our dependencies. So you have the requirements.txt file here. You just want to type in pip install our requirements like this and just let this run. So this will now install all the dependencies, and whilst this is happening, we can just start writing our backend code here. So the first thing we will do is import everything that we need. So I'm going to copy paste all of the stuff and just break it down quickly. So this is everything from FastAPI that we'll be using. We'll be using Pydantic. We are implementing this particular, so for templating, this allows us to render the HTML page. We don't want any issues with CORS, so we'll import CORS middleware. OS is to be able to manipulate files, to work with files, because as you saw, we have to upload an audio file from our device. Then the remainder here will just help us work with the image that's displayed and the audio processing. .env is important because we don't want to include any sensitive information by hard coding it in our code, in something that you might push to repo or share with other people. So this is a dependency that will allow us to store it securely. Logging, not the most important thing, but I like to have it as I build these projects. If I encounter situations where I'm building something new and I want to troubleshoot, logging helps a lot. Speech recognition will help help us with audio processing. And then finally, we are using OpenAI and requests to make these. So requests for HTML protocol requests and OpenAI to communicate with our OpenAI API. So that's all of our dependencies and imports. If you want, you can pause the video and just make sure you write this exact same thing. So we move on. We will create a .env file. So you want to make sure that it's in your working directory. So you want to write this OpenAI API underscore key equals, and then you want to include your API. So your API key from OpenAI. So I'm going to do this off screen, and you can do exactly the same. Once you have done that, now we can actually import that variable. So we will write load.env. We'll say that our OpenAPI key is OS, meaning the import that deals with files. As you saw earlier in the line 7 here, this import OS. So we are accessing that and saying get environment variable, and then we're giving the name of the variable. So now we can use that securely. We want to initialize our FastAPI app. So we'll say FastAPI. If need be, here we will use logging. So we can configure that later if we have to. That can stay as a to-do. So we want to mount our static files. So our FastAPI app needs to know where to look for our static files. If you look on the left-hand side, we have our folder static, and that's the place where we will direct our FastAPI to look. So at the moment over there, you have the CSS, and I've just included this logo from my YouTube channel. So all we have to do is say, look for it in this particular folder. And we'll say that those are the static files called static with name static. Now we want to be able to render our HTML page. So we will do templates and say the directory of it is templates. Just as we have the directory static, underneath we have templates, and that's where our HTML file is. So now is a good moment for us to open that front end and see what we have there. As we said, we will not be doing a tutorial on anything front end related, but we want to make sure that you understand once you're writing the backend code, what does it pertain in terms of the front end. So in your templates, index.html, open that, and we'll just quickly do a breakdown. So that's not really relevant. So this is just us saying the text of it. It's a lyrics extractor. So in our main, we have a form which will allow a user to upload an MP3 file. So we are saying choose an MP3 file. And then in the input type, we specify that it is like the ID file. So the type is file and it accepts .mp3. Then we allow these three. So you have these three options. And if you remember, it's a drop down between 3 languages, English, Russian, and Spanish. So then we have a button that submits this form. Once that button is submitted, we have some JavaScript here in this script tag that does that work for us. So once the submit button is clicked, the extract lyrics, this is the event that's triggered, and we execute a post request to our endpoint that we will define in our main.py file. So that's something that we will do now. That's not something that exists here, but ahead we are referencing that in our JavaScript logic here. So the Ajax code. It is pretty much similar. I believe in the previous tutorial we used fetch, and it's different, but it works on the same principle where we are defining the endpoint address, we are defining the type of the HTML request that we are doing. Then we are doing this JSON stringify to make sure that it's in adequate data form where we are expecting a response as well. So that's the JavaScript there. And as you can see, there is not much to the front end other than just these couple of elements that will accordingly display the different content as it's generated. So that's why we have these respective HTML elements. They're pretty self-explanatory. I don't think we need to discuss this furthermore, and we should focus on what matters more, which is the front end. So, oh, by the way, I don't want to forget, also in our static, we have some CSS just to make this app a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. But once again, not a front-end tutorial. So if you feel like exploring it a bit, studying it, by all means do that. And we will now focus again on our back end. So this is where we left off, and this is something that I just copy-paste from the documentation of FastAPI. There's always the same thing used for me, just to make sure that there is no cause issues. So for data validation, I might use just a particular schema. So I'm going to say that the lyrics payload inherits base model, and it's just one variable which will be a string. So to keep things a bit more organized, we might as well create a file, and we can call this schemas.py, and we will chuck this there. So we want to make sure we import Pydantic for this. Then going back to our main, we can go on the bottom here of the imports and just say import, or we can say from schemas import lyrics payload. So one thing when it comes to managing these different directories here where we will be storing content that's dynamically generated, I like to include some code that helps the logic of it by making sure that certain directories exist before it executes logic where it's supposed to save something in that folder. So just in case things get scrambled later on, if you're playing around, tinkering around with this project or any other project, I like to include something like this. So I say if this is null, and I will give the name of our converted files folder, we'll do os make this, so it will create a directory called this. So now if I just run this python main.py, you can see that it has created converted files folder. So if it doesn't exist, it creates it. If it exists, this becomes obsolete. I like to have it. So we can define our endpoints now. So we will have a get endpoint that will first render the HTML page. So this will be the response class of HTML response, and it can asynchronously call this method read root, which will just render the HTML page from our templates. So it will give return templates, template response, index.html, and also request. So leave that empty for now. So with this, we can already test that this runs as we need it to. So if we go into our terminal and type in unicorn main reload, we can see that it's running. So if you open your browser and check localhost 8000, we can see that we have the front end rendered. So nothing here will work because there is no backend that this can communicate with yet, but we know that so far so good, everything is working as intended. So going back to our backend, we can continue with our other endpoints. So we just create something like, we'll call it roots. So now what we want to do is create the endpoint where the button will go. So once the user clicks submit, we want to upload that file so we can initiate the processing of the audio file. So we'll say endpoint upload file and asynchronously called create upload file. So this will take in file as a part of the request, and also the language that we want the text to extract into. And this is a string. So we want to make sure, just like we previously made sure that we created a directory called converted files, now we want to create a directory uploads where we'll store all the files that the user chooses to upload. So let me just copy paste this bit actually. And this can be indented, but there'll be a difference in the name of the actual file. So it'll be called uploads. So as soon as the first time we actually try to communicate with this endpoint, then this logic will be executed and it will create our uploads folder. So next we want to store the file location, so the actual path. So as you can see in our file location variable here, we are storing this as an f string, and we'll say with open and then give it the file as file object. And we want to write file read, like so. So now we're going to be doing our audio processing. So for this, we'll say that WAV location of the file is, and then we'll do an f string, and we'll basically give it the same path as the MP3, but with just replaced extension. So it's not going to be .mp3, it's going to be .vav. Remember, this is not modifying a file, this is just giving the location of where we want to save the processed file, the converted file. Hence we are just effectively changing the name, just changing the string. And then now we want to call a function that will convert mp3 to .wav. So to do that, we'll create a new file, we'll call it utility.py. And in here now we'll write some logic that will actually do the conversion of that. So we will call this convert mp3 to WAV. So this will take a parameter of a path of mp3 and WAV. So I will say that audio is audio segment from mp3 and then the mp3 path, audio export. Now we give the WAV path and format WAV. And at this point, I want to make sure this actually happened successfully. So I will go back and implement the logging that I was talking about. So earlier, remember I said that if need be, we can use logging here. And I think it need be. Not just that it's necessary, but I believe it's good practice and it will help me stay ahead of any potential problems that might occur by telling me exactly where my problem is, rather than me having to spend time on troubleshooting. So we'll configure that by saying logging basic config level logging info. So we'll create a similar imports in our utility file. So what we'll need is logging. We will need this for audio processing. I'll copy these as well. So speech recognition, OpenAI requests, OS, and I believe that's all we need for now. These two, actually, let me do all of these. So if you want to pause and have a look at everything that I put here, so to make sure that you are on the same page. At the moment, it might be a bit redundant, but I'm trying to be time efficient as well and just making sure that I get everything. If there is an extra line here, it's not really a major problem for me now, as long as I get everything working. So back to our function. After this has happened, I want to get some kind of a message that will confirm this. So for that, I'm going to say logging.info and then just inform converted MP3 to WAV and give it the path of where it has happened. This will also let me know of the location of my file if for whatever reason I need to see it at that moment. Whilst we're here, we'll do another function, and this one will be to segment the file. So the reason why is only later I realized that OpenAI has a limit on the size of the file that you can give it to transcribe. So the go around method for this, the first thing I thought of, and by the way, there might be better ways, but I don't think it's necessary for the scope of this project. So what I do, I just split the audio in segmented parts, in small chunks, and then transcribe them one by one in smaller parts. And once it finishes, it comes up as text anyway. It's very easy just to join and display to the user, so it works quite fine. So you want to write function split audio, and it will again take the path of our converted file, and then we'll say that the chunk length can be this particular length of milliseconds. So we are splitting the entire file divided by, so if it's 5 minutes, it's going to be however many milliseconds in 5 minutes divided by 60,000. And we'll say that the chunk path is chunk index WAV. No, this is the wrong line. Going back on this, we don't need the path. We need to actually define what our chunks are. So quick re-edit, and we say the chunks is audio, and we want to define that audio above actually. So going one line above that, we'll say that our audio is audio segment, and then from WAV and giving it the path of our WAV file. Now we're going to take this audio variable and do some slicing here. So we'll take the index plus chunk length for I in range of 0 and give it the length of the audio, and then pass chunk length milliseconds. And this will return. So this will then split the audio physically into smaller segments, and then we want to transcribe each individual audio segment. So we will create a new function. So this will be transcribe audio chunk, and then this will take individual chunk and the chunk index, and we'll give it the path of each individual chunk. So we'll say that this is chunk and then the chunk index. So finally exporting these individual chunks. So and giving it the format WAV. So with this, we'll say try open chunk path as audio file. So now this needs to travel to our OpenAI API to get transcribed, and we will be using the model called Whisper 1. So I already prepared some code for this, and we can just copy paste it. If you need to, after you see the copy paste, you can pause the video and make sure you have the same thing. So we'll write an exception, store it as E, and then we'll again utilize logging to say that some kind of an error has occurred. And then we can actually inform what particular chunk caused the problem by passing the chunk index as the error. So we can give it the finally, and we can remove all the chunk files. So it's just a cleanup of after the processing has finished, and we will return the text. So we are still working on our transcribing methods. So we have written the first two. We can minimize them to make this a bit more readable and write our third one. So this one will transcribe the WAV to text. So it can take the path, and the chunks here will be the audio of the path of the file. Full text here is just an empty variable, an empty string as a placeholder, and we will write a for loop saying for I and chunk in enumerate. So going through all the chunks, we'll say that the chunk text, and then we will call the previous function of transcribing audio chunk. We'll pass chunk file and the chunk index. So now we want to make sure that we join in our full text transcription from each individual chunk of the video. So we will give chunk text plus an empty space, just a placeholder. So after this, we can do logging info and just inform what the outcome is. So we'll actually see it, for example, in the terminal here. And finally, we just want to return the full text, and you will use some string manipulation to strip. So these are the 3 methods that we will need to successfully do transcribing of the audio files. Now we can move on to the last method that we will include in our utility.py, and this will be the one that will provide with the summary of the lyrics. So if you remember, in our front end, we have the extracted lyrics that will display the entire transcription of the audio file, and then below it's the summary of the transcribed text. So what will provide that summary is what we will do right now. So it will be another asynchronous method. We'll give it an appropriate name. This will take in the parameter of text, which will be the entire lyrics or transcription of the audio file. And we will take the similar approach like before. We will have try and accept, and the accept will perform the similar logic as before. So it will just perform some error logging, and this can just be text that says that some kind of an error has occurred, just keeping us know that if there is a particular problem, we don't need to do any troubleshooting. It will tell us that it was during the text summarization, and then this will return something. Just put summary generation failed. That will suffice. So in our try, we will use something similar from what we have done before, and I'm just going to copy paste this particular response variable. So we are communicating with OpenAI's API. So the model is ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, and the prompt is just asking the OpenAI's API to do an assistant return of summarizing the following text in 1 sentence. And we are passing the variable of text, which, if you remember, in the parameter of this function is our audio transcription. After that, in our summary, we want to store the response and then just particularly define choices with index of 0 and with the message content. And just we want to strip this to make sure that it formats it for us, and then we can say logging for, and then this can be the generated summary displayed here for us. Just another way of keeping this good practice, and this returns summary. So that's all that we need in our utility.py. So with this, we can now return to the main py and make sure that all this is imported. So the first thing we'll do is write import utility.py. Sorry, not py, import utility. So now we should be able to use all of the functions that we have defined. Oh, no, let me particularly name them. So from utility, we will import, and then we can do all of these functions. So it was summarize text, transcribe, another transcribe, split audio, and our last one, convert MP3. So now we know that we'll have access to all of them, and we can now focus on finishing all of our endpoints. So if you remember where we left off with the post endpoint for uploading the file, so what the user will do from the front end. So we gave the location for the WAV file. Remember, this is not some kind of logic that will do conversion or processing. It's just naming the new file and making sure that the extension is no longer .mp3. So now we will actually use one of the functions from utility.py that will do the transcription. Sorry, not transcription, conversion. So now we can call this function convert mp3 to WAV, and we will give it the file location, and we will now also give it the AV file location. Then after it's been successfully converted and stored in our converted files folder, we want to extract the lyrics. So we will use our transcribe function for that and give it the location of our newly converted file. And there is no need for us to keep the MP3 file that the user has uploaded, so we can use OS to actually delete that file. So for that, we'll give it the file location to our os.remove command. Now we want to create our summary, and for that we can use await and do summarize text. So this doesn't run in a way that can break the logic, so this will await for the previous functions to finish. This might take a certain amount of time, and there are factors, different factors that can differentiate what takes longer or more shorter time. So for example, obviously larger files will not take the same amount of time to create transcriptions. So await will make sure that these tasks are run in a sequential manner. And then lastly, we can just return that our lyrics are lyrics and the summary is variable summary. So now we can go to our front end and test some of this functionality. So I've just uploaded a random song and clicked the extract lyrics button to see what the output will be. And if I go back to my VS Code, we can see that we successfully delivered this payload to our endpoint, and our logging initiated all this information to be shown to us. So the backend has successfully done the conversion from MP3 to WAV, and then you can also see that the backend has successfully executed the utility.py methods, communicated with OpenAI's API to provide this transcribed text. So these are the lyrics from the song that I've uploaded. And then there was another call that has done a prompt to OpenAI's API again to create a summary from the previous text. And you can see that it's successfully done exactly that. So now what we're trying to do is make sure that we create an image that's inspired by this one sentence. And just to make sure, I can see that the backend has successfully done everything that I wanted, but I want to see has it all been displayed accordingly to my front end. And as you can see, it has exactly how we expected it. In the extracted lyrics box, we see the lyrics from the song that I uploaded, and then in the summary, we see our sentence again. So the final missing bit now is to create an image that's inspired by the summary of the transcribed text. So for that, we will create a new endpoint, and this one will be generate image. Again, it's a asynchronous method, and we'll call it generate image. And it will take the lyrics payload. So again, we will use the try and accept exception struct. So first, for how we will actually try to generate this image, we need to use our API key. So just like previous, we are using OS and getting the environment variable, and this is called OpenAI API key. And then just to make sure that we have some troubleshooting logic if something goes wrong, as this is common and good practice, we will write that in case a program is not able to access our API key, or if the API key variable is null, then we will say logging error, API key not accessible, found, not found. And we can raise an HTTP exception with a status code 500. And give it the same details. So we can say, just copy paste this, wasn't found. So now we can do the URL for the OpenAI's image generation. And I'm just going to copy paste this online. You can Google this. So once we have that link, I want to take this approach. In my headers, I'm going to pass the API key. And again, I have this documentation written in front of me, so I'm going to copy paste this part too. So what's going on here is that we are passing the API key as a part of our header, and that's the way OpenAI will verify that we have access to the API features. So for the prompt, we can do an F string and say that we want. So keep in mind as well, you can modify this, you can write this the best way you think will fit your project, or to be honest, most likely you can tinker around with this and create a better prompt than what I'm about to do, because I already tested this and the outputs are just very not artistic, to say the least. So I'm just going to create an image based on this summary of a song, maybe something like that. I don't know. You try playing around with it a little bit more if you want a more quality product, but we are here to demonstrate how an architecture like this is implemented. So we want to make sure that we don't get any errors in terms of if there are limits for OpenAI's API, how they can process a certain amount of text. So we will try to say that if the length of this prompt is greater than 1000 characters, then we will just truncate it and we will do prompt and then slice everything above 1000. So just to make sure that the image that arrives is within some acceptable dimension parameter, we'll say that is prompt, the size of the image, and this is relatively arbitrary, but Feel free to play around with these dimensions if this means anything to you. But I'm quite happy with these dimensions, and we want just one picture, that will suffice. So again, trying to keep up with the good practice of logging the information, we can do an f-string and communicate to our server saying that we are sending the request to OpenAI API with the following data. We can include the data. So we can see actually what we sent the prompt with. And then we'll store the response and say that it's the request post, and then we'll pass the URL. Headers will be headers, and the JSON will be data. So this is what we are creating our request with, these parameters, and then storing the response that comes in the response variable. Again, we want to do some logging, and we will say that OpenAI API response status is, and then we can pass the response.status code. And we can also do logging.info, so some more logging for response content. So we will actually show all of that in the terminal here as the server is running. And we'll do raise for status. So the image, well, we want to store it and say that it's response.json. So in our data, list 0, and we extract the URL. So the response is image URL here. So we'll do a get request for that. And again, we'll do image response raise for status. So then we want to now show that image as in late in our front end. So we will say that image open, and then we'll use bytes.io image response content. And we want to use a similar approach before we did with creating that directories in case they're not there. So we'll say that if this particular folder does not exist, then we'll use OS to actually create that folder here, and our image path being os.path join, and we'll use media and generated image PNG. So this will be the name for our image. You can, if for whatever reason want this to be different, change that and have it called whatever you want it really. So we want to save the image as the image path, and just to know that everything went fine here, we can do some logging and say we'll do an f-string that image was saved at and give it the file path. And lastly, we return an object that will say that the image path is, and then the variable of image path. I believe that's pretty self-explanatory there. So we want to write some smart code, so we'll do accept requests.exceptions, request exception as error, and then in our logging we can pass that and say that request exception was the variable e, which will hold the error that has happened. And we want to raise an HTTP exception, and we'll give it the status code 500, the detail of error, and we just want to make sure that it's a string. So I had some issues before with this data being not the appropriate data type, so just want to preemptively put that there. And the last thing that we need to display our image, I'm going to show you in our front end. So as you can see here, this code with Ajax is going to do a post request to generate an image with the summary, so as a prompt. And then upon success, what we want to do is then actually fetch that image. So in order to show it, we need to communicate with our endpoint media generated image.png, and that's something that does not exist yet. So that'll be the last thing that we need to do, is to create a new get endpoint, and we'll call it generated image.png, and this will be another asynchronous method. We'll call it, give it an appropriate name, and all that this will do is return the file, which will be the image that we have just generated. So this will go into the media folder and fetch the image. And that should be all for our project. So now we can do some unit testing. So going to our front end, I'm going to choose a completely random song from my computer. I know it's in English language, so we will do extract lyrics. Looking in my VS Code, we can see that our logging utility is working fine and giving us information that the conversion from .mp3 to .wav has started. And when I look into my converted files, I can see that song is actually there. So as you can see, the backend has successfully transcribed the text, and it looks exactly like the lyrics of this particular song. And also then the second aspect of our backend has requested this summary. This text describes a sense of determination, resilience, and strength in the face of challenges, with a focus on survival and perseverance through difficult times. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So now we want to create an image, and we see that we got an error. So something is wrong with this particular aspect. We do not have our image yet. So we will do some troubleshooting and try to find why has this happened. So I can see a typo. If we go to our endpoint here, it's not supposed to be generate image, but rather generate underscore image. So we'll save and try doing it again. So I have the same song there. I'm just going to click extract lyrics. So the same lyrics will show up here, but what I'm expecting now is that with the generated image, there will be some kind of an image produced by OpenAI's ChatGPT that will be based on this particular summary. And looking at the VS Code's terminal, I can see now that it actually has executed the post request successfully. So as you can see here, the logging command has given us this information that the prompt has included the summary and the other parameters that we defined. So everything went fine here. We have the status 200 and the content then being the link of the image. So everything here looks fine. So now when I go back to my front end, I should be able to see this piece of artwork. And this is what he gave us. I don't know how is this inspired by this particular summary that you see here. This is bloody awful, but hey, it's not me. It's the current state of the art, isn't it? Let's try and see maybe if we modify the prompt, can we get something more consistent with the actual summary. So previously the prompt was generate an image based on the summary of a song, and then we passed actual lyrics. Maybe we shouldn't do lyrics, we should do the actual summary. So let me try maybe writing a better prompt here. So I'm going to write something like, I have a song and I will summarize the lyrics from this song. I want you to generate a beautiful art based on this summary. Here is my summary of the text. So let's see, does this change anything? I'm not really an expert for this type of prompt engineering, especially for creating something artistic. That's probably the exact opposite of what I feel I have some kind of a talent for, but nevertheless, we shall try. So I will try and use the exact same song just to be able to compare. So this is our previous one, and let's see, has our new prompt made any type of an improvement. So once again, just going back to our backend, so you can see that all of the logging is doing its thing there, so we can follow along how this process is sequentially happening. Wow, this is even worse. So my prompt has made it considerably worse. So when it comes to art, this is definitely not producing the best results. And just for fun, I want to try and see how this same prompt will perform in ChatGPT's new model. So as a tangent to this project, we will actually take the exact same prompt, copy it, and chuck it in ChatGPT. So I think it'll be quite funny to see the massive difference between the model that we are using here. So this definitely needs a much better model rather than this particular one that my API is communicating with here. I'll leave that part up to you, and just to demonstrate what kind of a difference it can make, please have a look at the image that ChatGPT 4.0 has created from the exact same prompt. I think this is actually hilarious. So the difference is substantial from this. I don't even know what to call this previous one, but as you can see, I did a direct copy paste of the exact same prompt, and please read the summary and then look at the picture. I feel like, wow, this actually did create a very fitting image for the song. So as you can see, if you tinker around and implement a better model for this particular part of this project, you can get considerably better results. I'll leave that artistic aspect up to you. This particular tutorial, you've seen how to implement this architecture, and there's plenty of room for improvement upon your own personal preferences. Today we will build this particular web app. You'll be able to upload any image that has text on it and have the text extracted from the image directly onto the page, so it will be displayed here. So we'll test the app right now. I'm going to upload a picture. We click extract. So this was the picture that I uploaded. This was just randomly Googled. And as you can see, the text is extracted and it appears for the user right above. So without further ado, let's start building this app. The first thing you want to do is navigate to my GitHub. I'll leave the link in the description, and you can find this particular repo. We will get the link for it and we can move on into our VS. So we will just open a brand new folder, do git clone, paste that link, and we can start building together from this exact file system. So you can see a couple of files already there, and we have to discuss a couple of things that you need before you can run this project. So the first things first, let's install everything that Python needs to run this. Good practice is to create your own virtual environment so none of your dependencies clash, and we will do that. So in this particular folder, you can navigate. In our working folder, we can create a new environment. So we can say Python, and this should create a new environment for us. I'll navigate to PowerShell, but you can activate this any way you really want, the in Bash or PowerShell. So going into to activate it, we want to go, we want to go into the script folder. No, we want to go into VNV first and then scripts. So here, if we type in activate.ps1, we can activate our environment. And as you can see now, there's this prefix with the exact name of my environment, meaning that now we have activated our environment. So just to reiterate, for those of you that haven't done this before, you type in this particular command to create a virtual environment. So this is the command. After you run this, you navigate into the scripts folder, and there you activate by typing in this ./activate.ps1. So now we will install the dependencies that we need for our project. And you can see in this requirements.txt, you have everything listed here. So you can just type in, we want to make sure that we are in the main folder again. So we will go back, and now we can type in pip install our requirements.txt. This will install all the dependencies that we need for this project. Lastly, we need to discuss how we will be implementing the AI aspect of this web app. So we're going to be using PyTesseract, and now we have installed the Python wrapper for it, but we also need to install the proprietary software and run it on our machine. And the way to do that, if you go into README, I've written some basic explanation on how to do that. So we need to install this Python wrapper. We have just done that. So that was us installing with pip. But we also need to install this. So navigate to this link and install Tesseract for Windows. Without this, you won't be able to run the program. I will include the link for this as well in the description, but anyone can just Google Tesseract for Windows installation and it will give you the download option. And as soon as it's installed, that's it. You're ready to go. With all the requirements met, you can start building this project. Next thing we want to do is to make sure that we can run our Flask app. So we will just prepare the layout for our web app, and we can discuss then one by one what goes in which file. You will see that as soon as you did git clone, you already got this config.py. I don't think there is much necessary to discuss here. This is just the configuration file for our Flask app, and you can basically just use it the same way how you see it here. Here, only thing you might want to do different is define the uploads folder, the uploads file path for yourself. So if you remember, our app had an option to upload the image that will then be giving the text extracted to the display. So this will be the folder where those images get uploaded to. So you can choose any folder in your documents. It's entirely up to you. Other than that, I don't think there's anything necessary to discuss in regards to the config.py page. Moving on, we want to create a app.py, and this will be the main file that actually runs our app. And all it's going to say from app import app. So this will go into the app folder, this one here, where we will have all the files for our web app, and it will just import that into our file here, the one that runs the backend. And we will say that if name is _main, then we just want to run our app. That's all we are going to do with this. And we'll create another file here where we'll write the logic for the AI processing, but we're going to leave this empty for now. And then if you navigate into your app folder, you'll see that you have two subfolders, static and templates. In the templates, you'll see index.html. If you open that, you will see that there is already pretty much everything done here. The reason why most of this is already completed is that I didn't want to focus this particular tutorial on building front end, even though we will discuss this front end so that you understand every line of code here. So I will guide you through it, but I didn't think it will be necessary. It will be kind of a waste of time to discuss every single aspect of this, especially talking about CSS and stuff. It's not the purpose of this video. And then in the static, you will see that you have two subfolders, images and uploads. And this will just manage when we want to upload a picture. All of them will go into this particular folder called uploads. So as you saw earlier, this was the picture that I used for test. So it naturally ended up being uploaded into this folder. And in the images here, I'm just using the logo from my channel. This is something you can, for the sake of just practicing and building the same app, you can use this. You don't have to, you can put anything you want here, or you can ignore it entirely. You can delete this one. That's entirely up to you. But that's the brief explanation of our folder structure. And with that being said, we can start building our app. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do the backend logic of our AI processing of the image. So we just installed the Tesseract and we can start writing the code for that. So this will be our AI model that will take an image as an input and give text as output. This is just a brief explanation for it. So we'll get an image as an input and the output coming out will be a string derived directly from the actual image. So we want to start by importing our libraries, both NumPy as NP, and to manage images, we'll import this and just change this back to import. So we want to specify the path to the Tesseract executable. So earlier I mentioned to you that you have to download the Tesseract software, their proprietary software. And the way to do that is by going onto the GitHub link. When you find the installer, the Windows installer, and once the installation is finished, you want to get the path and copy it into this particular variable. So most likely it'll be the same as you see it here. If it's not, you might have to do some tinkering and find this exact file. So this is needed for the program to run. You want to save this file path into this variable. So we'll write our function that will extract the text. Parameter for it will be the file path of the image file, and it will return a string. So like we said, the AI model will take an image as an input. So that's the image path, and the output being a string type. That's this bit here. So we want to say that image will use the image library from PIL, and it will open the image path. So the variable passed in our method, and then Tesseract will do its magic and do image to string from image. We want to remove symbols and split by lines for better display. So this is just for readability, and I've actually produced this just by querying ChatGPT what characters could kind of be problematic in that sense. So to manage then this particular idea, we want to write this line here. Moving on, we're going to create some distance. Once again, we are with these last 3 lines of code, we are just working on creating readability in our output. And this will just split the lines with a break. So if you remember from like Python basics, this end character here will create, it's like a space line to create some division. And then finally, we want to just return text lines. So this will be the string output. So that's all. This library pretty much does everything for you, and that's how simple the AI aspect of it is. And we want to try and test this now and see if this runs properly. So we're going to say test and run by saying image path, and we want to give the path of the image. So I might just use the one that I had here, again. So I will go and copy. Let's try copying relative path. So we'll give it the path. I believe I need to change these two /s to. Just want to test this and make sure that I'm actually printing this. So if we do python ml.py, yes, it gives me the correct path to the image, as we can see. So it's always good to test these things before you actually run your program or something like that. You catch errors before they become too much to handle. So we will say then that the extracted text is, and then we want to run our function that we just defined here. So we can just call the function and give it the parameter of our image path, which was this. So if we give it that, and then we want to just show our extracted text, so we can print this particular variable. So the extracted text is, and then we can just give it the variable. So if we try running this now, got an error. So I've just changed the way how the path is given. So we want to delete this bit, and we'll just give it a dot to say from the current file, from the current directory, go into app. And I believe this is all we need to do. So if we run now, we see that we get the extracted text in this particular string. So this works now, and that's all we needed for our backend. We can comment this out and move on. Next thing we want to do is go into our app folder, and we will open templates just to discuss the front-end aspect. So like we said, we will not write this code from scratch. I don't think it's necessary for this particular project. We can just discuss that it's just a HTML page with some CSS and Bootstrap. That's all it is, using this particular Bootstrap. There is some CSS that will just give some aesthetic aspects, but nothing too complicated. You can examine this on your own and play around with it if you choose so. So closing the CSS aspect, we can just talk about what's in the body of the HTML. So we have our upload image button, and upon submission, there is some logic, some templating that handles how once the image has been processed and we have our text in the form of a string, this is just some templating that will handle how it's being displayed. And that's pretty much all that it is. So without talking, if we open this by itself, if you open this by itself, just as a file, you can see how it looks. Like I said, the upload image element with the browse option for selecting the image, the button to extract, and then once we receive the output, when our backend processes the AI code we have just written, it will be formatted here. And we want to also display the image that we got the text from. So with the front end being sorted like that, we can now move on to building our Flask app, which I believe is the most important part of this video. So as you saw, the actual AI itself, we have Tesseract doing all the work for us. It's a very simple function. It just does all the work. We don't really have to do more than that. So we want to now build our Flask app. So the first thing we do is we'll create two new files. One called it views.py and the other one called init with 2 underscores, like such. So in this init file, we want to import Flask, and we want to say that our app is Flask. And then for the configure file, we will use the file that we got just from the Git repo. So we'll say from object, and then we will name this file config development config, like such. And we will also import views, and that's it. That's all you need. So the last thing that we need to do to finish off our web app is to write the backend logic in our views section. So again, we want to import Flask and app, and we want to request render template and URL for. We will also want to import OS to handle files. I have this recommendation from ChatGPT to use this particular library as a method of dealing with files when changing or modifying file names. So we'll move on with that. We also want to include your typical NumPy, SNP. We again need PIL and image. random string, and we want to import our function that we built. We want to add the path to config. So we'll say that app config is initial file uploads, and we will give it a path. So for us, that's in our static, and we'll write our route to the home page, the only page that we'll be using for our web app, and it will include methods both get and post. So I am assuming that at this stage you are familiar to at least the basics of HTTP protocol, and specifically the 4 requests that you can make: get, post, put, delete. So kind of basics of your CRUD systems, which stand for create, read, update, delete. If this line here means absolutely nothing to you, I would suggest finding a dedicated video for this particular reason. If you want a good understanding of what we are doing here, you wouldn't necessarily need to completely understand this just to finish off this web app, finish off this project, but I do highly recommend so. That being said, we're going to move on and write our index function, and this will now handle the flow of data. So we'll say that the full file name is URL for static, and the file name is in the images, so that's where we'll be storing. And then we want to say if image upload is now empty, so we will say if request.method is post. That's what we want to handle first. Then we want to define the image upload to be the request files of image upload. So what we're doing here is saying that if there is a post request, it expects a file in the payload of that post request. And that file will then be stored in the variable image upload. So if you go back to what our web app looked, once the user clicks browse, once they choose the image they want the text extracted from, that image will go here into this image upload variable. So we want to save the file. Now we're going to use the secure file name and say that image upload.file name. And then we want to define the file path using the OS join with app config initial file. Initial file uploads, comma file name. We'll say that image upload.save in the file path. So now we want to use the Tesseract app, and we'll just use the method we created in our ml.py. So we want to call this particular method now and pass it an image that got uploaded. So we will say that the extracted text is the function. So we are calling this function right now. If you remember earlier, we wrote this line here, and this line invokes the usage of this particular function from our ml.py file. So we'll pass the file path for the image, and we want to have the image URL for static. We'll give it the file name uploads plus file name, and in our return we want to render the template that will be displayed. So we want to render the template of our HTML file that earlier we were looking at. So it's this particular HTML file, and we'll say that the URL is image URL, and the full file name is file path, and the text is extracted text. So we need to pass this back onto our front end, and this covers any post request coming towards this endpoint. So we have defined this endpoint. We mentioned that it will handle get and post requests, and the first thing find in our conditional statement here is what happens if there is a post request coming. This is the logic for the post request, and our return statement will finish processing of our post request. But else we want to handle a get request, and we will again give the HTML template. We want to give file name is full file name, and lastly, this is just the standard for Flask apps. Just going to copy paste this bit. Main function for our Flask app, and you want to write this if _name _ is main, app.run debug equals true, and that's all we need to do. So let's try running our app now. So I'm going to type in, let me open this a bit more. So we want to write Python app.py, and we can see that our app is running live on our local host, port 5000. So we will open our browser and we will type in localhost, give it the 5000 port, and you can see that we have our front end, but let's see does it work with the backend. So I'm choosing again that image, I'm clicking extract, and the image is displayed with the text above. So everything works as intended, and this is our app. I hope you enjoyed it, and that's all. The first thing you want to do is navigate to my GitHub. I'll leave the link in the description, and you can find this particular repo. We will get the link for it, and we can move on into our VS. So we will just open a brand new folder, do git clone, paste that link, and we can start building together from this exact file system. So you can see a couple of files already there, and we have to discuss a couple of things that you need before you can run this project. So the first things first, let's install everything that Python needs to run this. Good practice is to create your own virtual environment so none of your dependencies clash, and we will do that. So in this particular folder, we can navigate. Now working folder, we can create a new environment. So we can say Python, and this should create a new environment for us. I'll navigate to PowerShell, but you can activate this any way you really want, the in Bash or PowerShell. So going to activate it, we want to go, we want to go into the script folder. No, we want to go into VNV first, and then scripts. So here, if we type in activate.ps1, we can activate our environment. And as you can see now, there's this prefix with the exact name of my environment, meaning that now we have activated our environment. So just to reiterate, for those of you that haven't done this before, you type in this particular command to create a virtual environment. So this is the command. After you run this, you navigate into the scripts folder, and there you activate by typing in this ./activate.ps1. So now we will install the dependencies that we need for our project. And you can see in this requirements.txt, you have everything listed here. So you can just type in, we want to make sure that we are in the main folder again. So we will go back, and now we can type in pip install our requirements.txt. This will install all the dependencies that we need for this project. Lastly, we need to discuss how we will be implementing the AI aspect of this web app. So we're going to be using PyTesseract, and now we have installed the Python wrapper for it, but we also need to install the proprietary software and run it on our machine. And the way to do that, if you go into README, I've written some basic explanation on how to do that. So we need to install this Python wrapper. We have just done that. So that was us installing with pip. But we also need to install this. So navigate to this link and install Tesseract for Windows. Without this, you won't be able to run the program. I will include the link for this as well in the description, but anyone can just Google Tesseract for Windows installation, and it will give you the download option. And as soon as it's installed, that's it. You're ready to go. With all the requirements met, you can start building this project. The next thing we want to do is to make sure that we can run our Flask app. So we will just prepare the layout for our web app, and we can discuss then one by one what goes in which file. You will see that as soon as you did git clone, you already got this config.py. I don't think there is much necessary to discuss here. This is just the configuration file for our Flask app, and you can basically just use it the same way how you see it here. Here, only thing you might want to do different is define the upload folder, the upload file path for yourself. So if you remember, our app had an option to upload the image that will then be giving the text extracted to the display. So this will be the folder where those images get uploaded to. So you can choose any folder in your documents. It's entirely up to you. Other than that, I don't think there's anything necessary to discuss in regards to the config.py page. Moving on, we want to create a app.py, and this will be the main file that actually runs our app. And all it's going to say, from app, import app. So this will go into the app folder, this one here, where we will have all the files for our web app. And it will just import that into our file here, the one that runs the backend. And we'll say that if name is _main, then we just want to run our app. That's all we are going to do with this. And we'll create another file here where we'll write the logic for the AI processing, but we're going to leave this empty for now. And then if you navigate into your app folder, you'll see that you have two subfolders, static and templates. In the templates, you'll see index.html. If you open that, you will see that there is already pretty much everything done here. The reason why most of this is already completed is that I didn't want to focus this particular tutorial on building front end, even though we will discuss this front end so that you understand every line of code here. So I will guide you through it, but I didn't think it will be necessary. It will be kind of a waste of time to discuss every single aspect of this, especially talking about CSS and stuff. It's not the purpose of this video. And then in the static, you will see that you have two subfolders, images and uploads. And this will just manage when we want to upload a picture. All of them will go into this particular folder called uploads. So as you saw earlier, this was the picture that I used for test. So it naturally ended up being uploaded into this folder. And in the images here, I'm just using the logo from my channel. This is something you can, for the sake of just practicing and building the same app, you can use this. You don't have to, you can put anything you want here, or you can ignore it entirely. You can delete this one. That's entirely up to you. But that's the brief explanation of our folder structure. And with that being said, we can start building our app. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do the backend logic of our AI processing of the image. So we just installed the Tesseract and we can start writing the code for that. So this will be our AI model that will take an image as an input and give text as output. This is just a brief explanation for it. So we'll get an image as an input and the output coming out will be a string derived directly from the actual image. So we want to start by importing our libraries, both NumPy as NP, and to manage images, we'll import this. And just change this back to import. So we want to specify the path to the Tesseract executable. So earlier I mentioned to you that you have to download the Tesseract software, their proprietary software. And the way to do that is by going onto the GitHub link. When you find the installer, the Windows installer, and once the installation is finished, you want to get the path and copy it into this particular variable. So most likely it will be the same as you see it here. If it's not, you might have to do some tinkering and find this exact file. So this is needed for the program to run. You want to save this file path into this variable. So we'll write our function that will extract the text. The parameter for it will be the file path of the image file, and it will return a string. So like we said, the AI model will take an image as an input. So that's the image path, and the output being a string type. That's this bit here. So we want to say that image will use the image library from PIL, and it will open the image path. So the variable passed in our method. And then Tesseract will do its magic and do image to string from image. We want to remove symbols and split by lines for better display. So this is just for readability, and I've actually produced this just by querying ChatGPT what characters could kind of be problematic in that sense. So to manage then this particular idea, we want to write this line here. Moving on, we're going to create some distance. Once again, we are with these last three lines of code, we are just working on creating readability in our output. And this will just split the lines with a break. So if you remember from Python basics, this end character here will create, it's like a space line to create some division. And then finally, we want to just return text lines. So this will be the string output. So that's all. This library pretty much does everything for you, and that's how simple the AI aspect of it is. And we want to try and test this now and see if this runs properly. So we're going to say test and run by saying image path, and we want to give the path of the image. So I might just use the one that I had here again. So I will go and copy. Let's try copying relative path. So we'll give it the path. I believe I need to change these two /s to. I just want to test this and make sure that I'm actually printing this. So if we do python ml.py, yes, it gives me the correct path to the image, as we can see. So it's always good to test these things before you actually run your program or something like that. You catch errors before they become too much to handle. So we will say then that the extracted text is, and then we want to run our function that we just defined here. So we can just call the function and give it the parameter of our image path, which was this. So if we give it that, and then we want to just show our extracted text, so we can print this particular variable. So the extracted text is, and then we can just give it a variable. So if we try running this now, got an error. So I've just changed the way how the path is given. So we want to delete this bit, and we'll just give it a dot to say from the current file, from the current directory, go into app. And I believe this is all we need to do. So if we run now, we see that we get the extracted text in this particular string. So this works now, and that's all we needed for our backend. We can comment this out and move on. Next thing we want to do is go into our app folder, and we will open templates just to discuss the front-end aspect. So like we said, we will not write this code from scratch. I don't think it's necessary for this particular project. We can just discuss that it's just a HTML page with some CSS and Bootstrap. That's all it is, using this particular Bootstrap. There is some CSS that will just give some aesthetic aspects, but nothing too complicated. You can examine this on your own and play around with it if you choose. So closing the CSS aspect, we can just talk about what's in the body of the HTML. So we have our upload image button, and upon submission, there is some logic, some templating that handles how once the image has been processed and we have our text in the form of a string, this is just some templating that will handle how it's being displayed. And that's pretty much all that it is. So without talking, if we open this by itself, just as a file, you can see how it looks. Like I said, the upload image element with the browse option for selecting the image, the button to extract, and then once we receive the output, when our backend processes the AI code we have just written, it will be formatted here. And we want to also display the image that we got the text from. So with the front end being sorted like that, we can now move on to building our Flask app, which I believe is the most important part of this video. So as you saw, the actual AI itself, we have Tesseract doing all the work for us. It's a very simple function. It just does all the work. We don't really have to do more than that. So we want to now build our Flask app. So the first thing we do is we'll create two new files. One call it views.py and the other one called init with 2 underscores, like such. So in this init file, we want to import Flask, and we want to say that our app is Flask. And then for the configure file, we will use the file that we got just from the Git repo. So we'll say from object, and then we will name this file config development, like such. And we will also import views, and that's it. That's all you need. So the last thing that we need to do to finish off our web app is to write the backend logic in our views section. So again, we want to import Flask and app, and we want to request render template and URL for. And we also want to import OS to handle files. I have this recommendation from ChatGPT to use this particular library as a method of dealing with files when changing or modifying file names. So we'll move on with that. We also want to include your typical NumPy, SNP. We again need PIL and image, random string, and we want to import our function that we built. We want to add the path to config. So we'll say that app config is initial file uploads, and we will give it a path. So for us, that's in our static, and we'll write our route to the home page, the only page that we'll be using for our web app, and it will include methods both get and post. So I am assuming that at this stage you are familiar to at least the basics of HTTP protocol, and specifically the 4 requests that you can make: get, post, put, delete. So the basics of your CRUD systems, which stand for create, read, update, delete. If this line here means absolutely nothing to you, I would suggest finding a dedicated video for this particular reason. If you want a good understanding of what we are doing here, you wouldn't necessarily need to completely understand this just to finish off this web app, finish off this project, but I do highly recommend so. That being said, we're going to move on and write our index function, and this will now handle the flow of data. So we'll say that the full file name is URL for static, and the file name is in the images, so that's where we'll be storing. And then we want to say if image upload is now empty, so we will say if request.method is post, that's what we want to handle first. Then we want to define the image upload to be the request files of image upload. So what we're doing here is saying that if there is a post request, it expects a file in the payload of that post request, and that file will then be stored in the variable image upload. So if you go back to what our web app looked, once the user clicks browse, once they choose the image they want the text extracted from, that image will go here into this image upload variable. So we want to save the file, and now we're going to use the secure file name and say that image upload the file name, and then we want to define the file path using the OS join with app config initial file uploads comma file name. We'll say that image upload.save in the file path. So now we want to use the Tesseract app, and we'll just use the method we created in our ml.py. So we want to call this particular method now and pass it an image that got uploaded. So we will say that the extracted text is the function. So we are calling this function right now. If you remember earlier, we wrote this line here, and this line invokes the usage of this particular function from our ml.py file. So we'll pass the file path for the image, and we want to have the image URL for static. We'll give it the uploads plus file name, and in our return we want to render the template that will be displayed. So we want to render the template of our HTML file that earlier we were looking at. So it's this particular HTML file, and we'll say that the URL is image URL, and the full file name is file path, and the text is extracted text. So we need to pass this back onto our front end, and this covers any post request coming towards this endpoint. So we have defined this endpoint. We mentioned that it will handle get and post requests, and the first thing find in our conditional statement here is what happens if there is a post request coming. This is the logic for the post request, and our return statement will finish processing of our post request. But else we want to handle a GET request. And we will again give the HTML template, and we want to give file name is full file name. And lastly, this is just the standard for Flask apps. Just going to copy paste this bit. Our main function for our Flask app. And you want to write this if _name is main, app.run debug equals true. And that's all we need to do. So let's try running our app now. So I'm going to type in, let me open this a bit more. So we want to write Python app.py, and we can see that our app is running live on our local host, port 5000. So we will open our browser and we will type in localhost, give it the 5000 port, and you can see that we have our front end. But let's see, does it work with the backend? So I'm choosing again that image. I'm clicking extract, and the image is displayed with the text above. So everything works as intended, and this is our app. I hope you enjoyed it, and that's all. So we will be building this app. As you can see, it's offering you to download videos, and you'll be able to put a link from YouTube and choosing whether you want a individual video, individual audio, and you can also download playlists. So you can copy paste the link, choose your path, and you can just click download and it will work. So without further ado, let's write some code and see how we build this exact app. So let's try to describe how we are going to approach this app. So this is some doodling I've already done here, and you can clearly see we have the distinction between backend and frontend. So we are doing our YouTube video downloader app, and we want the app to download YouTube videos, songs and playlists. We want to have a simple but nice looking GUI that's user friendly. So that will be the GUI that we will build with Kivy. When I thought about what kind of design to use, I'm just going to include some kind of a logo. This will be like a Dropbox that will feature 4 options. So to give the user the option to do one video, playlist of videos, one song, or playlist of songs. So clearly we want then to correspond each of these 4 options with these 4 functions in the backend. Let me just do 4 of these. So this particular Dropbox will include 4 options, and then each of these options will correspond with downloading one of these 4. And then we want a file path, so it'll be some kind of a browse option. We'll then give file path to where? To backend. So with this, we only now need the link. So we can say then that if we have another box here, we can say that this will be the link input, link for download. So with this, I know that I can have 2 inputs from the user. One being where the user wants to store the file, and the second one being the link of the YouTube video that they want to download, or link of the playlist. So then we can take this and give it, this will go into one of our 4 functions as a parameter. Is this drawing? Yes, it is. So if you have the thinner draw, so we will have 2 parameters on all of the 4 functions, where x will be, in this case, it's going to get a bit messy, but you get the idea. The x will correspond with the link, and the y will correspond with the file path. So we will pass that onto our backend functions. And then we just want to click download, and the download should execute the rest of the function. So this will be our approach onto our design. It's quite simplistic. The front end is just a GUI that will give the user the option to choose where to store the file and which file to download. And the backend will just have 4 functions that correspond with the option of the user of what they want out of the download link. So with that being said, we can move on and create this app in code. So first things first, we'll import the libraries that we'll be using. So we'll use PyTube to download YouTube videos. I will say from PyTube import list and YouTube. When we want to download audio songs, we will actually have to convert them. So PyTube can only download videos from YouTube. So if you want to end up with a song out of that video, you have to convert it here in Python yourself. And we'll be using MoviePy for that. So we'll just import everything from there, and we'll import OS to manage the file paths. One thing that I like to do for every project is to install the dependencies into a virtual environment, just to make sure that you have this project isolated from the rest of your dependencies. So we will do that. We'll open the terminal. I prefer to use PowerShell, but it's entirely up to you how you do this part. So all we want to do is create a virtual environment. So we'll do Python, we'll do this command. So then we will navigate into, I believe it's the scripts. So we want to navigate into this folder now and activate this environment. So we'll do that, and we'll do activate, I believe, yes. So you can see we have activated our environment. It tells us in this prefix that we are in this environment now. So we want to install the dependencies that we'll be using. So the quickest way to do it is to use this requirements.txt, and all that we will need is, we don't need this for now. All that we will need is these two libraries for the backend, and we will build our front end with Kivy. So just these three libraries. So we'll say pip install this. And now when we run this, we should be able to see that the libraries are being installed. Alright, until this finishes, we can start writing our backend code. So continuing this part, we will start by defining our class, call it YouTube downloader, and this will include our 4 functions. So I can just do a layout of our functions. So we'll have 4 of these. So we have 4 functions, and we'll pass the self parameter as well as such. I want to name these properly, so they should be called something that makes sense. And then we can just copy paste this. We want to name these functions in a way that will make sense to us as well. So this one will download a single video. In the meantime, we can see that all of our libraries were installed, so I can minimize this for now and continue naming our functions. So then we can do one that downloads a playlist of videos. We can do one that downloads video as audio, so when you want to download a song in MP3 format. So we can call this one download video as audio. And then in case you want to download a playlist of videos but save them in MP3 format, this one can take a link of a playlist and download all of them. That's brilliant. I think this will be the structure that we use to build our 4 functions. If you remember, this is what we had as a plan, to have 4 functions that we will then connect to our front end later. Moving on, we want to start writing our code for our functions. So the track for this can be that we try to execute the logic of downloading, and if it doesn't work, we can pass an error. So give it an exception and then print out that error so that we know what went wrong. And then we can do this. So this is just good practice to make sure that we attempt certain logic, and if it doesn't work, we get an explanation of what went wrong. That being said, let's write the download logic. So the way this library works is that we need to instantiate this YouTube objects, and we pass it the parameter of the URL, the link of the YouTube video we want to download. Then we want to select the highest possible resolution. If you want to play around with this, you can examine the documentation, just do some research, but there's no reason for me to go that deep into it at this point. I just wanted to download the best quality of video available. So we will define the file extension here as well, and then we can say to this get highest resolution. So we want to make sure that we got the link, that the link of the YouTube video we want has been passed on through our function. So we can print that. We can say that the video title is, and then here do yt.title, and this will give us the full name. Then we want to set the save path and the file name. So we'll say that in our file name variable we store the name of the video, but we want to make sure that no illegal characters pass on and cause a potential error. So I've played around with this earlier, and sometimes if you have a particular character written in the name of the YouTube video, this program will know how to handle it and it throws an error. So I went to ChatGPT and I've asked it to think of any possible character that could throw an error and just replace it with an underscore. So let me show you what that looks like when I copy paste this part. So we are saying that we want to replace this character with that one. And this goes on for all these examples. You can see pretty much what the point of this is. You can get this exact line of code, or you can skip this part entirely. But for me, this has ended up working fine. So for example, there was a video with this character in the name of it, and it gave me an error. So this line of code will make sure that this character gets replaced with an underscore. So you can get this line if you open my GitHub. You can take the exact one I did, or you can do your own. It's completely up to you. So now we want to write the logic for the download with this specified file name. So we will say stream.download, and then we'll pass on the save path that we initially gave as a parameter in our function. So we'll do output path, and we'll say that this is the save path, and the file will be file name. We want to print some context. Video saved as, and we can just say something like saved as, then the file name. And we can also say in the location save path. So this is our first function, and we can test it now. So let's see how this works. So I'll minimize this for now to try this function. So I'm going to open here on the side just any video, a first video that comes out, and see if I copy paste the link, you will see it in a second. So if I say that XYZ is this particular link, so this is just a YouTube video, and I say that XYZ2, this will be my file path. So I can try getting this from, let's try doing it here. So we will create a folder here. Say create this folder, test313, and then we can get this path. I believe I need to change these, and we will give the name of our folder. So now we can try to execute the logic of the first function. So we will say download, no, it's within our class, so we need to access the class. I will choose to download a single video, and we will pass these two parameters, the link and the file path. So let's see if this works now. So if we try running, so there was an error, so this should be capital, like such, saying that it's not defined. Oh, there as well. We should be good now. So we run this script, and there's another error. Let's see why is that the case. So this might be because we specified self. Let me try putting none here and running it now. Again, let's try removing this for now. YouTube object has no attribute stream. Oh, this should be streams, plural. And we can see now that it says it was completed successfully. And if I check here, we can see that we have this file. So something that you can notice is that this file's extension is not defined. So at the moment, the type of this file is .file. And I don't want that. I want this to be .mp4. So we will write some logic now that will take care of that. So let's redo this. So as I said, we want to add the .mp4 extension to the downloaded video. The shortest way I thought about doing that is to just use some pure Python string manipulation. So I will say that the new extension is .mp4. So I just want to add this to the end of my file. And I already had the save path, and the name was file name. It was this. So I already have the file name and the actual path of the file. So I'm just going to say that my separator is the backslash because I want to construct a file. So I want to identify the file and save it in a variable. So I'm going to say that the full path is the save path plus the separator plus the file name. So this will just identify the downloaded file, this particular file, and take its path as a string and store it inside of this, inside of the full path. So we can then check, we can write some logic to make sure that this works properly. So we can say if not, os.path exists, and then we give the string path of our downloaded file, we won't know that. So we will say the file of file name does not exist. Simple as that. So that's just to catch a potential error. And then now we want the new name, which will be the old name plus this new extension. So we're adding this .mp4. So we'll just write that the new full path is the old path plus the new extension, like this. This might not be the best way to do it, but it works. So now we want to actually rename the file, and then we can pass the old and the new name that we want, which we defined in these two variables. And then I'd like to see that this worked, so we'll write that our file was renamed to, and then we can just pass the new full path. So now I'll rerun the exact same test code that we've written, and I expect now this same file to be downloaded, but this time to be in a .mp4 format. So we'll rerun the code, and there we go. It's been downloaded, and now it's .mp4. So that's brilliant. I'm happy with that. This works, and we can use practically the exact same approach to write the rest of our functions. So now we want to do the same, but we just want to download, no, we want to download the whole playlist. So that's what we'll do now. We'll write the logic for that. So it's slightly different in a sense that we will just modify certain bit, like here, instead of starting with instantiating the YouTube object, we need to let it know that we want to download the playlist. So we will say download playlist and give it the URL. The link that will be passed will be the link of the entire playlist. And then we want to iterate through the YouTube playlist and just approach downloading each video individually. So let me try doing that. Let me try writing a for loop that will say for each video URL in the URL, no, in the playlist object, because we store that in variable p. Brilliant. So in here we'll say status, what video is being downloaded at that moment. So we can say just write the name of this, and then we will just repeat the same process from earlier. Technically we could just pass this function now, because in this for loop we'll be doing the exact logic of this first function. But for the sake of the video, we might just write the logic again. But everything should be exactly the same. Let's try doing it that way first, actually. So we can say YouTube downloader, then download single video, and then we are passing the video URL and the save path. So let's see if this will work. Once this for loop iterates through the entire YouTube list. We want to know that it has finished. All videos have been downloaded in MP format. So let's try this now. So as you can see, our list downloading is working, and we don't need to write the manual code for going through for iterating through this list. We can just use recursion here, and we are just reusing this function of downloading a single video. That worked fine. And now with this, we can very quickly write the logic for the remaining two functions where we want to download a single audio song, let's say, or a playlist of audios. The only exception will be now that after downloading a video, we will have to convert it ourselves to an audio file. Say that we want to instantiate this object, give it a URL file, URL link. We can print that we are downloading that particular from, and we can say, again, it's just a title. We want to select the best quality available. So we can say that YouTube streams only audio is true, and we want to pick the first. In case that's not available, we can print some logic just to let us know. And this goes here. So we want to define the output file and say that that's the audio stream which we want to download, and we will pass the parameters to let it know where we want to save it, which is our save path. And we can do a print statement so that we know where the file went. Now we have to manually convert our file to an MP3. So first we can find the actual file and add it the .mp3 extension. So this is similar to what we did earlier, where we added the .mp4, because the PyTube will just download type file. So now we are manually adding the .mp3 extension, and after that we can say that converting file to MP3, and our audio clip will be audio file clip of the output file. And need to write some more logic for it. Is the new file with the codec being MP3, and then we want to close this file. Not close. And then we just want to remove the original that was not .mp3. So we can say OS remove the original file and print conversion complete, and just some additional logic. This is our new file. And then if something went wrong, we have our error, so we can try and test that. Again, just creating a folder that can test this. Going back to YouTube just to copy paste a link for the first video that I see, because this is just testing. So I'm giving it some random song from YouTube, and now we want to download a video as audio. We passed the link, we gave it the file path of test313, this folder here. So now when we run this, we expect to see this downloaded in MP3. We get an error, so there's a syntax error at line 51. I believe this was or not. Audio stream, yep. I put that in the wrong place, so that should work now. Again, this being the problem. Testing now, so an error has a. So this is the error. This should be only, no, sorry, output path, and it equals save path. So now if we rerun this, brilliant. We see that this function works. Great. So same logic. Now we will write the function to download a playlist, and we can reuse a lot of the same logic from our function that download the playlist of videos. So we will go into that function, and in the try, again we're doing the same thing. We are saying to instantiate our playlist object, passing the URL of the playlist, and then we want to iterate through the YouTube list. And the only difference will be that we are not going to run the function to download a single video. We'll download the function to download video as audio. So Let's try doing that. And then we can try passing YouTube downloader, download video as audio, and we will give it the video URL and say path parameters. And then if everything goes well, we want to say all files convert to MP3. So now we want to test this. So you can go on YouTube and find any public playlist to try and test this. So I want to run the function for it here. So we want to download playlist as MP3. And we can see so far that this is working. So everything is being downloaded here. And I'm going to stop the code from running further because I can see that everything works as intended. And this means that we have just successfully completed our backend. So we can delete this. One thing going further that I want to add is the self parameter in all of our functions. I deleted it whilst we were doing testing, but when integrating with Kivy, this might be necessary for me. So return the self parameter first, and we can close this and continue building our front end. So let's do that now. So we'll be using Kivy to build the GUI for this. So I'm going to copy paste all the imports, and I advise you to do the same. If you open my GitHub, you can see the full file for front end, and just copy paste all the libraries, and then we'll continue manually building the code for the rest. Oh, there is another thing that I want to copy paste, and I got this directly from the documentation for Kivy. So the custom styles using Kivy's builder for rounded corners and background styles, like some sort of equivalent of CSS for Kivy, just to give a bit more of a aesthetically pleasing look to the elements that we're going to build. So by all means, please copy paste this yourself. So we can start first by importing the backend file that we built. So we can say from backend 1 import, and then we can import our class. We want to import tkinter, that's tk. From tkinter we want to import file dialog. Now we can choose the primary color for our window. We'll just say to get color, and this will be white. We want to define the class for the styled button, and this will inherit from button. And now we will start building our GUI. We'll give it this name. It will inherit the from box layout. We'll define our init method. We can take all the parameters and refer to the init to all key arguments, and we will choose the orientation to be vertical, padding 20 and spacing 10. I've chosen to include a logo from my channel in this GUI. It will just be this picture. You don't have to do this, you can skip this part for the logo, but if you want to do something similar, just include the name, include the picture in your main folder, and then we'll just use this name here. So we'll say that self logo is the image. We'll give it the source, which is in our folder, in our working folder, and we'll just define the dimensions, and we'll keep the ratio true and allow stretch true. Now we will add this as a widget, add self logo. So we will continue building, and we will do a self.spinner and call onto the spinner object. I will say that the text is select download type. So I want to show you exactly what this part is now, what we are building. So if you remember, if we go back to this drawing that I made, we made the decision that this button here will be a drop box that will give 4 options, each representing one of these functions respectively. So we are building this drop box here right now, and that's the spinner widget in Kivy. So now when you know what it does logically, I find it a bit easier to understand the code for it. So the multi-line will be false. Now we don't need the multi-line. We'll give it the values. So our 4 functions were to download a video, to download a playlist of videos, to download audio, or download list of audios, call it audios, like this. We'll give it the size hint to be 1 and 0, 1, and the background color we can use. I forgot to add the comma and here. And then the last bit will say that the background normal is an empty string. So now we want to add this widget just like we did with the logo. So we're doing this, but we are adding the URL input. So now we want to do the path input with rounded corners. So this will be the box that allows the user to add the path where the file will be downloaded. So we'll say that self.path input is text input, and this object will have loads of parameters as well. So the size hint being 1 and 0.15, multi-line is false, read-only is true, and the text for it will be enter where you want to download your files. Files, doesn't matter. And we'll say the background normal is again an empty string, and the background color, and we'll choose maybe 6 of these, and the foreground color will be all ones. And lastly we want to add this widget again, so we are adding the self.path input. So I forgot one thing here. So this actually is adding the widget for a spinner, and then to have our link input we'll do something similar to this. We'll define this to be a URL input. This can be smaller, this can be 0.2, and this can be enter the link of the file you want to download, and then all of this will be the same. And we just want to add this to add widget self.url input. Just so there is no confusion, I'm going to zoom out and talk about this for a second. So in our class where we are building our GUI, the constructor function, the constructor method in it, is where you can build widgets and then add them. So we start off by putting the logo on top. So that's a widget. This is the code for it, and then this is the line of code that adds that widget that we built. We build it here, we add it here. So now that's how we approach it. We are building the drop-down box with these options. This is where we build it. This is how we add it with the add widget line. So then when we wanted to build the box to add the ability for the user to choose to put the link of the file they want to download, this is how we built it. Again, we are adding it with the add widget option. So then we have choosing where the file will be downloaded. Same thing happens again. So we want to add some styling for the path button, and we'll do that here. So zooming in a little bit again so you can see, and we can write self path button is a style button. So this object will have the name for the button, which is browse. Size hint will be 101. The background color, the color from hex, and self button will bind this that when this button is pressed, it opens the self.open file dialog. So this will be outside of this actually, and then we are just going to add this widget, self.path button. That's great. Now we added the button that will allow the user to click this option, adding the path input, and then the button will open the typical window where you can manually navigate and find the folder where you want to download your file. So now we'll add the button for download, and we can pretty much reuse this code, and we will just say that this is a download button now, and instead of browse you'll say download, It will have the same size, but we can choose a different color, like green color or something like that. So we'll remove this. I think this is the hex code for that. And the difference now will be that when this is run, we want to start download. So instead of this, we will say self.download button, and then on press it will start the download. And then we just want to add this widget, so it will say download button, like so. Brilliant. So now we want to write the logic for displaying the messages. So we'll say that the message is label object. We'll give it the size, staying consistent with what already we declared. We'll give it color, and it can be the same color. And just like before, we'll add the widget that we just built and say self message label. Now we want to write the function for opening the file, and this is the way we choose. We give the user the option to choose where to download the file, but we want them to navigate through it, like the same way how every single file opener works. And this is just the code for that. That's brilliant. So we have this. Now we want to write the function that will be attached to our download button, the one we mentioned here. We'll have self and instance, and we can give it some text here. I will say that the download type is self-spinner text. So if you remember the drop-down box that we built, this is the download type for us, and we are giving the URL of strip and the save path input.text strip, and we want to catch an error in case we don't have a URL. Similarly, if we don't have a save path, we want to catch that error too. So we don't want the user to be pressing this button, the download button, if they haven't successfully given a valid link and a valid file path. Because if you remember, our backend featured those 4 functions of each having 2 parameters, the URL and the path where the file will be downloaded. So we want to say that the downloader is the YouTube downloader. And now the final logic is to try if the download type, so if that drop down box, the choice was to download video. Let me just see the text for the drop down box. So download video, playlist of videos. So let me have these values handy here. So I can just build this quickly like so. So we'll do some copy pasting here to save time. Download audio, download playlist of videos. And we want to run our downloader object here. So we can say, and here as usual we want to catch an error, and we want to push that error into our messaging, and then we can print it here too. So in here we can actually write the logic now for download single video with the parameters of URL and save path. And we'll do some copy pasting again, saving time, but we'll choose different functions that correspond with what's chosen here. So this will be downloading list of videos, so download playlist. This will be downloading a single audio, and this will be downloading the whole playlist of audio. That should be it. And lastly, we want to build self-return downloader, the class that we just defined. And we are just adding the last line. If this is main, then we want to run our app. So that should be it. So let's try and give this a run. So let's see how our GUI looks front end py. We get an error. So troubleshooting. Another error is that I forgot to give the correct method here. So with the audio type, we want to make sure that we choose video as audio. So the rest should be fine. Let's try running this. Error again. I think I've identified some of the typos that I've done. So the first one being when adding the widget for the path input. So the first typo that I found was these two selves here, so the delete. I found the typo. This is a dot. It shouldn't be. It's an underscore. So now we have an error again. Another typo. This is allow stretch, but clearly I didn't type it correctly. Here we are now. It actually runs properly. So this is our app. So let's test it now. We can choose the download video. We'll give it a link of first link that I found on YouTube. We will choose to download it in my test folder. So I am choosing that right now. You can't see it, but when you click browse, it will just prompt you with a regular window that allows you to navigate exactly where you want this thing to be downloaded. So now going here, we'll press download, and we can see that it has successfully downloaded. That is wonderful. So the app works, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to have a look at the new videos that will be coming after this one.